The 12th Legion came into being during the latter stages of the Unification Wars, forged in the gene laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains alongside their brother legions. The Emperor's gene rights had labored to create 20 distinct lines of super warriors, each bearing a fragment of their creator's own genetic template filtered through the unique physiological matrix of a missing Primarch. The 12th were among the middle legions to reach full operational status, their gene seed proving remarkably stable, and their neophytes displaying an unusual tolerance for the aggressive augmentation process that transformed baseline humans into legions Astartes. From their first deployments on Terra, the 12th Legion demonstrated a particular aptitude for close-quarters warfare that set them apart from their brother legions. Where the 7th excelled at siege warfare and the 13th at combined arms tactics, the 12th showed an almost preternatural skill for shock assault and brutal melee engagements. Their early doctrine centered on rapid deployment into the heart of enemy formations, breaking cohesion through sheer ferocity before the opponent could properly respond. The gene seed of the 12th seemed to enhance already aggressive tendencies in its recipients, producing warriors who actively sought close combat rather than merely accepting it as a tactical necessity. The Legion earned their first official designation as the War Hounds during the pacification of the Caucasus Wastes. A tech barbarian warlord had fortified a series of underground complexes, and conventional assault patterns had stalled against prepared defenses. The 12th Legion deployed in company strength, breaching the fortifications and hunting their enemies through kilometers of twisting tunnels. The campaign lasted 3 weeks, and the War Hounds gave no quarter. Survivors from the tech barbarian forces reported that the Emperor's warriors had fought like unleashed hounds, relentless and savage in their pursuit. The name stuck, and the Legion adopted it with pride. Under Terran command, the War Hounds developed a reputation that walked a fine line between admiration and unease. They were undeniably effective, with a victory record that compared favorably to any of their brother legions. Their loyalty to the Emperor was absolute, never questioning orders regardless of how brutal the assignment. Yet there was something in their methods that troubled even the most hardened Imperial commanders. The War Hounds didn't just defeat their enemies, they annihilated them with a thoroughness that went beyond military necessity. Prisoners were rare in War Hounds campaigns, not because of official policy, but because their warriors simply didn't stop fighting until nothing remained standing. The Legion's Terran commanders recognized early that this aggression needed direction and discipline. Without their Primarch to guide them, the War Hounds could have easily devolved into little more than sanctioned berserkers. Instead, the senior officers instituted a system of gladiatorial combat traditions that channeled their warriors' violent impulses into structured competition. These weren't the refined dueling circles of the 3rd Legion or the honor-bound sparring of the 6th. War Hounds' pit fights were brutal affairs conducted in training cages aboard their fleet vessels, where warriors fought with practice weapons until one couldn't continue. The fight served multiple purposes. They maintained combat readiness, established pecking orders within companies, and gave the legionaries an outlet for aggression between campaigns. These gladiatorial traditions drew heavily from the background of many War Hounds recruits. The Legion's primary recruitment base came from the hive gang fighters of Terra's sprawling urban complexes. The underhives of Terra bred a particular kind of survivor, young men who had learned to fight for every scrap of food, every meter of territory, every breath of clean air. They understood violence not as an abstract concept, but as a daily reality, and they possessed an instinctive grasp of close-quarters combat that formal training could refine but never fully replicate. The War Hounds recruiters specifically sought out these gang fighters, recognizing that their brutal upbringing produced candidates whose psychology meshed well with the Legion's combat doctrine. The recruitment process itself was characteristically direct. War Hounds recruiters would descend into the underhives and issue challenges to the gang territories. Young fighters who showed exceptional skill and survived the initial trials would be taken to the Legion's training facilities. The attrition rate was high. The 12th Legion's gene seed might have been stable, but the psychological demands of becoming a War Hound were extreme. Those who survived emerged as legionaries who understood war as their natural state of being. When the Great Crusade began in earnest, the War Hounds deployed alongside the other legions to bring the galaxy into imperial compliance. Their early campaigns demonstrated the effectiveness of their shock assault doctrine on an interstellar scale. On Vaxilin Secundus, 3 companies of War Hounds broke a defensive line that had stalled 2 army regiments for 6 months. They made planetfall at night, hit the enemy fortifications with melta charges and breaching shields, and were in hand-to-hand combat before the defenders could coordinate a response. By dawn, the War Hounds held the primary defensive positions, and the army could advance. The cleansing of the Genid cluster showcased the War Hounds operating at full Legion strength. The Genid worlds had fallen under the control of a Xeno species that had fortified each planet into a death trap of interconnected defense networks. The War Hounds' approach was characteristically straightforward. They identified the central command nodes on each world and launched simultaneous assaults, fighting through whatever defenses stood in their way. The campaigns were grinding, bloody affairs that lasted for months, but the War Hounds never wavered. They pushed forward through casualties that would have broken lesser forces, and when the cluster finally fell, it fell completely. The Legion's organizational structure during this period reflected their Terran origins and combat focus. Companies operated with significant autonomy, each led by a captain who had proven himself in countless engagements. The War Hounds didn't maintain the elaborate hierarchies of some brother legions. Rank was earned through combat effectiveness, and respected only as long as the holder continued to demonstrate their capability. This created a meritocratic culture where even junior legionaries could rise quickly if they showed the necessary skill and aggression. It also meant that War Hounds officers led from the front, fighting alongside their warriors rather than directing from command centers. The Legion fleet reflected their practical approach to warfare. War Hounds vessels were maintained for function rather than appearance, their hulls scarred from countless campaigns and their interiors stripped of unnecessary decoration. The training cages occupied significant space aboard every ship, and the sounds of combat practice echoed through corridors at all hours. The fleet's tech marines focused on keeping weapons and armor operational rather than pursuing technological innovation, and the ships themselves were configured for rapid deployment rather than extended void warfare. Relations with the Emperor during this period were characterized by the same straightforward loyalty that defined the War Hounds' entire existence. When the Emperor issued orders, the War Hounds obeyed without hesitation or complaint. They didn't seek glory or recognition beyond their assigned objectives. They didn't politic for favorable assignments or petition for additional resources. They simply fought where they were sent and destroyed what they were told to destroy. This reliability made them valuable assets for campaigns where other legions might question orders or seek alternative approaches. The War Hounds' reputation among their brother legions was complex. They were respected for their combat effectiveness and reliability, but few legions sought close cooperation with them. The 3rd Legion found their methods crude and their culture lacking in refinement. The 13th appreciated their tactical directness, but preferred more flexible approaches. The 6th recognized kindred spirits in the War Hounds' ferocity, but were disturbed by the absence of any restraining cultural framework. The War Hounds seemed not to care about these opinions. They had their purpose, and they fulfilled it with single-minded dedication. Yet even during these years of success, there were signs of something darker underlying the Legion's nature. Apothecaries noted higher rates of aggression, related incidents among War Hounds legionaries compared to other legions. Warriors would sometimes continue fighting even after battles had ended, turning on training servitors or each other if no other targets presented themselves. The gladiatorial traditions helped manage these tendencies, but they were symptoms rather than causes. The gene seed itself seemed to amplify aggressive impulses beyond what was seen in other legions, and without their Primarch's guidance, the War Hounds had no framework for understanding or controlling this aspect of their nature. The Legion's Librarius, small even by the standards of the early Crusade, documented concerning patterns in the psychological profiles of War Hounds veterans. Extended combat deployments correlated with increased difficulty in transitioning to non-combat situations. Some warriors reported a constant low-level rage that required conscious effort to suppress. Others described combat as the only time they felt truly alive, with everything else seeming muted and distant. The librarians had no solutions to offer, only observations that went into sealed reports sent back to Terra. The discovery of Angron on Nuceria should have been a moment of triumph. The Emperor had found another of his lost sons, another piece of his grand design for humanity's future. Instead, it became the foundation for one of the Great Crusade's greatest tragedies and set the 12th Legion on a path that would end in damnation. What the Emperor found on that world was not a conquering warrior king like Horus or a sage leader like Guilliman, but a slave dying by degrees, his mind and body ruined by technology never meant for a Primarch's physiology. Nuceria was a civilized world by the standards of the Great Crusade, with advanced technology and a complex social structure. The planet's ruling class maintained their power through a combination of political maneuvering and public spectacle, and nothing drew crowds like the gladiatorial games. These weren't simple blood sports, but elaborate productions that consumed enormous resources and shaped Nucerian culture. The greatest gladiators became celebrities whose victories and deaths were commemorated in art and literature. The arenas themselves were architectural marvels, some capable of holding hundreds of thousands of spectators, with force fields and gravitic manipulation allowing for combat scenarios impossible on less advanced worlds. The infant Primarch arrived on Nuceria like his brothers had arrived on their respective worlds, violently and without ceremony. The Chaos Gods had scattered the Primarchs across the galaxy, and Angron's gestation pod crashed in the mountains far from Nuceria's major cities. He should have been found by explorers or settlers who would have recognized his obvious superhuman nature and brought him to the planet's rulers. Instead, he was discovered by slavers who saw only a valuable commodity. Even as a child, Angron was obviously different from baseline humans, with strength and resilience that marked him as something extraordinary. The slavers took him, and he vanished into Nuceria's gladiatorial system. The details of Angron's early years in the fighting pits are fragmentary, pieced together from Nucerian records and the scattered memories the Primarch himself retained after the butcher's nails had done their work. He grew rapidly, his Primarch physiology expressing itself even in the brutal conditions of slavery. By the time he reached physical maturity, Angron stood as a giant among the other gladiators, capable of feats that seemed impossible even by Nucerian standards. He won fight after fight, killing opponents with his bare hands when weapons weren't provided, surviving scenarios designed to produce spectacular deaths. The Nucerian High Riders, who owned the most successful gladiators, competed not just for arena victories, but for technological advantages. They employed tech adepts to enhance their fighters, pushing human physiology to its limits and beyond. Standard augmentations included enhanced muscle fiber, subdermal armor, and improved reflexes. The most valuable gladiators received more extensive modifications, becoming living weapons that barely resembled their original human forms. For Angron, the High Riders decided on something more ambitious. They would implant archaeotech devices called the Butcher's Nails. The Butcher's Nails were not Nucerian inventions, but relics from the Dark Age of technology, imperfectly understood and dangerously unstable. The devices interfaced directly with the brain's limbic system and aggression centers, artificially stimulating them while suppressing other emotional responses. A gladiator fitted with the nails experienced constant low-level pain that could only be alleviated through violence. The act of killing triggered the nails to flood the brain with pleasure signals, creating a neurological addiction to combat and bloodshed. The technology was meant for baseline humans and came with severe side effects even then. Most recipients survived only a few years before the nails caused catastrophic neurological damage. Installing the Butcher's Nails in a Primarch was an act of staggering ignorance. The High Riders who ordered the procedure had no conception of what Angron actually was. They saw only an exceptionally valuable gladiator who needed to be made even more aggressive and controllable. The tech adepts who performed the surgery worked with tools and knowledge inadequate for the task, cutting into a brain that operated on principles they couldn't begin to understand. The nails were designed to interface with human neurology, but a Primarch's mind was as far beyond human as human was beyond animal. The devices couldn't properly integrate with Angron's neural architecture, instead creating a constant state of malfunction that caused him excruciating pain. The immediate effects were exactly what the High Riders wanted. Angron became an unstoppable force in the arena, fighting with a fury that terrified even other gladiators. He killed with mechanical efficiency, his enhanced Primarch abilities now coupled with technology that removed any hesitation or mercy. The crowds loved him, and his owners grew wealthy from his victories. But the nails were killing him slowly, degrading his brain tissue and destroying the very qualities that made Primarchs more than just powerful warriors. His capacity for strategic thought diminished. His ability to feel emotions beyond rage and the brief satisfaction of violence faded. The person Angron might have become was being erased piece by piece. Despite the nail's influence, Angron retained enough of himself to recognize his situation for what it was: slavery, pure and simple. He began to organize other gladiators, speaking to them between fights, building relationships despite the nail's constant interference with his emotional capacity. Many of the gladiators were like him, slaves who had known no other life, and they responded to someone who offered even the possibility of freedom. Angron's plan was straightforward because the nails no longer allowed him the cognitive flexibility for elaborate schemes. They would rebel, kill their owners, and flee to the mountains where Nucerian authority was weakest. The rebellion succeeded far beyond what should have been possible. Thousands of gladiators rose simultaneously across multiple cities, overwhelming their guards through sheer numbers and desperation. Angron led his followers out of the city of Descia, fighting through Nucerian military units that tried to stop them. His Primarch abilities made him nearly unstoppable, and the other gladiators followed in his wake, breaking through every attempt at containment. They reached the mountains with the Nucerian High Riders' armies in pursuit, and there they prepared to make their final stand. The rebel army numbered perhaps 20,000 by the time they reached the mountains, a mix of gladiators and slaves who had joined the uprising. They were poorly armed, exhausted, and facing professional military forces with artillery and air support. Angron knew they couldn't win. The nails made it difficult for him to plan beyond the immediate moment, but he understood that much. Yet the alternative was returning to slavery, and that was impossible to accept. The rebels fortified positions in the mountain passes and waited for the Nucerian forces to attack. The Emperor arrived during the final battle. His fleet had been searching for the lost Primarchs, and his navigators had finally located Angron's unique psychic signature. The Emperor materialized on the battlefield with a force of custodians, expecting to find his son in a position of strength, perhaps ruling Nuceria, or at least commanding its respect. Instead, he found Angron standing among the dying remnants of a slave rebellion, the Primarch's armor cobbled together from scavenged pieces, his weapons taken from fallen enemies, his mind ravaged by crude technology that never should have touched him. What happened next became the defining moment of Angron's existence and shaped everything that followed. The Emperor could have intervened in the battle, could have used his power to save Angron's followers and crush the Nucerian forces. He could have demonstrated to his son that loyalty and sacrifice would be rewarded. Instead, he teleported Angron away, removing him from the battlefield while his army died in the mountains below. The Emperor's reasoning remains unknown. Perhaps he judged the rebel cause lost and saw no value in prolonging the inevitable, or perhaps he believed that removing Angron from immediate danger took priority over other considerations. Whatever his reasons, the result was catastrophic. Angron materialized aboard the Emperor's flagship and immediately tried to return to the surface. He fought the custodians who restrained him, his Primarch strength barely contained even by the Emperor's finest warriors. He could only watch through view screens as the Nucerian forces overran his army's positions and slaughtered everyone who had followed him to freedom. The men and women who had trusted him, who had believed his promise that they would die free rather than live as slaves, were cut down while he stood helpless light years above. The butcher's nails screamed in his skull, demanding violence he couldn't enact, and something in Angron broke that never healed. The Emperor explained that Angron was a Primarch, one of 20 sons created to lead humanity's conquest of the galaxy. He was to command the 12th Legion, tens of thousands of warriors created from his own genetic template. He would have fleets and armies at his disposal, would bring entire worlds into imperial compliance, would stand as one of the Imperium's greatest champions. Angron heard these words through the nail's constant interference and felt only contempt. He had been a slave who fought for his freedom and the freedom of others. Now he was being told he was a general who would enslave entire planets in the Emperor's name. The hypocrisy was too obvious to ignore, even with his damaged mind. The psychological and physical condition that Angron brought to his legion was catastrophic. The butcher's nails caused him constant agony, a baseline level of pain that never subsided and could only be temporarily relieved through violence. His brain tissue was actively deteriorating, the nail's incompatibility with Primarch neurology causing progressive damage that no amount of medical intervention could fully arrest. Imperial tech priests examined the devices and determined that removing them would kill Angron immediately. The nails had integrated too deeply into his brain structure, and extraction would cause fatal hemorrhaging. The Emperor himself studied the problem and reached the same conclusion. Angron was dying, and nothing could stop it. The only question was how long the process would take. The cognitive effects were equally severe. Primarchs were designed to be more than just warriors. They were statesmen, philosophers, and leaders capable of governing entire sectors of space. The butcher's nails had destroyed much of this capacity in Angron. His ability to engage in long-term strategic planning was compromised. His attention span shortened by the nail's constant demands for violent stimulation. Emotional connections became nearly impossible to form or maintain. He could feel rage and the brief satisfaction that came from killing, but subtler emotions were muted or absent entirely. The parts of his mind that should have allowed him to inspire loyalty, to understand his sons as individuals, to build the kind of bonds that existed between other Primarchs and their legions, all of this was damaged or destroyed. When Angron assumed command of the 12th Legion, he did so with open resentment. He had never asked to be a Primarch, never wanted to lead a legion, never agreed to participate in the Emperor's grand design for humanity. He had been a slave, then briefly a free man leading other slaves toward freedom, and now he was a slave again, just one with a longer chain and more elaborate duties. The War Hounds who met their Primarch for the first time saw a giant of a man whose face was marked by constant pain, whose scalp bore the ugly scars where the butcher's nails interface ports had been installed, whose eyes held a rage that never fully subsided. Angron rejected virtually everything about his role as Primarch. He showed no interest in the Legion's traditions or its history of service to the Emperor. He didn't care about their victories or their reputation. When senior officers tried to brief him on the Legion's organization and capabilities, he listened with obvious impatience, the nails making it difficult for him to focus on anything that didn't involve immediate violence. He looked at the warriors created from his gene seed and saw not sons, but reminders of his enslavement, tools the Emperor had created to enforce his will across the galaxy. The fundamental rejection went deeper than simple resentment. Angron understood, in the moments when the nails allowed him clarity, that he was a hypocrite. He had fought for freedom on New Syria, had led slaves in rebellion against their masters, had been willing to die rather than accept bondage. Now he commanded a legion that brought worlds into imperial compliance whether they wanted it or not, that killed anyone who resisted the Emperor's vision for humanity's future, that enforced a tyranny spanning entire star systems. The contradiction was impossible to reconcile, and Angron didn't try. He simply accepted that he was damned, that whatever he might have been had died in the mountains of New Syria, and that what remained was just a weapon pointed at the Emperor's enemies. His physical presence among the Legion was sporadic and unpredictable. The nails made it difficult for Angron to remain inactive for long periods, and he would sometimes disappear into the training cages for days at a time, fighting anyone who would face him. Other times he would lead assaults personally, throwing himself into combat with a fury that shocked even War Hounds veterans. After battles, he would sometimes stand among the dead, the nails' pleasure signals flooding his brain while he experienced the only relief from pain his existence allowed. The War Hounds learned to recognize these moments and give their Primarch distance, understanding that approaching him while the nails were active could prove fatal. The Butcher's nails were archaeotech devices that predated the Age of Strife, relics from humanity's golden age when technology bordered on the incomprehensible. The Nucerian High Riders who had implanted them in Angron possessed only the most superficial understanding of their function. Imperial tech priests who examined the devices after Angron's discovery determined they were sophisticated neural augmentation technology, though calling them augmentation was generous given their actual effects. The nails consisted of cortical implants that interfaced directly with the brain's limbic system, hypothalamus, and prefrontal cortex through a network of microscopic filaments that spread throughout the neural tissue like roots. The technical specifications revealed a design philosophy fundamentally at odds with the Emperor's vision for human enhancement, where the process of creating space marines amplified human capabilities while maintaining psychological stability. The nails achieved their effects through systematic destruction of higher brain function. The devices worked by artificially stimulating the amygdala and other aggression centers, while simultaneously suppressing activity in regions responsible for emotional regulation, long-term planning, and empathy. Neural pathways associated with pleasure and reward were rewired to respond primarily to violent stimuli, creating a neurological feedback loop where only combat and killing provided relief from the constant pain the nails generated as a baseline state. The pain itself served as the control mechanism. Subjects fitted with the nails experienced continuous discomfort that intensified during periods of inactivity, compelling them toward violent action. When the subject engaged in combat, particularly when killing, the nails flooded the brain with artificially generated pleasure signals that temporarily overrode the pain. This created an addiction more powerful than any chemical dependency because it was hardwired directly into the brain's reward systems. The more someone with the nails killed, the more they needed to kill to achieve the same relief, and periods between violence became progressively more unbearable. For Angron, whose Primarch physiology operated on principles the nails designers had never anticipated, the devices functioned as instruments of torture. His brain constantly tried to reject the foreign technology, triggering immune responses that the nails suppressed through localized neural inhibition. The result was a state of perpetual malfunction, where the nails couldn't properly integrate, but also couldn't be expelled. Imperial Medicae staff documented progressive degradation of Angron's brain tissue in the regions where the nails interfaced most directly, with cellular death spreading slowly but inexorably through his neural architecture. Apothecaries estimated that without intervention, the damage would eventually reach critical brain structures, resulting in death within perhaps a century, an eye blink for a Primarch's expected lifespan, but long enough to cause immeasurable harm. The Emperor's decision not to remove the nails, whether due to genuine impossibility or other considerations, left the 12th Legion facing an unprecedented situation. Their Primarch was dying, his mind was being destroyed by malfunctioning archaeotech, and his psychological state made him fundamentally unsuited for the role he was expected to fill. Other legions had Primarchs who inspired through charisma, led through tactical brilliance, or commanded through sheer force of personality. The War Hounds had a Primarch who made no secret of his contempt for the Imperium, who rejected the very concept of his legion's existence, and who was in constant physical agony that made him dangerous to approach. The legion's response to this situation emerged gradually, without central coordination or official sanction. It began with individual warriors seeking to understand their Primarch's condition. War Hounds had always prided themselves on their willingness to endure hardship alongside their brothers, and some saw Angron's suffering as something they should share rather than merely witness. These warriors approached the Legion's apothecaries with requests that initially seemed incomprehensible. They wanted the butcher's nails implanted in themselves. The apothecaries' first response was refusal. The nails were clearly killing Angron, and introducing such destructive technology into the Legion's ranks violated every principle of the Legion's Astartes creation. The Emperor had designed Space Marines to be enhanced humans, not lobotomized berserkers. The chief apothecary at the time compiled extensive documentation on the nails' effects, demonstrating conclusively that implantation would result in progressive neural degradation, loss of tactical flexibility, and eventual death. He presented this information to the warriors requesting the procedure, expecting it to end the matter. Instead, the requests continued. The warriors who volunteered understood the consequences and accepted them. They argued that their Primarch suffered alone, isolated by pain that none of them could truly comprehend. How could they call themselves his sons if they refused to share his burden? The Nails might be killing Angron, but they were also part of what he was, and the Legion's bond with their Primarch required them to bridge that gap regardless of cost. The arguments had a certain logic that appealed to the War Hounds' existing culture of endurance and brotherhood through shared hardship. The first implantations were performed quietly, almost secretly, by apothecaries who had been convinced or coerced into cooperation. The procedures took place in isolated Medicae facilities aboard Legion vessels, away from official oversight. The apothecaries worked with fragmentary data extracted from examinations of Angron's nails, attempting to recreate the devices using Imperial technology. They lacked the original schematics and had to reverse engineer the function from observed effects, resulting in implants that were crude approximations of the Archaeotech originals, but no less destructive for their simplicity. The initial subjects were veteran sergeants and company champions, warriors who had served with distinction since the Legion's Terran days. The implantation process itself was brutal, requiring extensive surgery to install the cortical interfaces and neural filaments. Space Marine physiology made them more resilient than baseline humans, but the nails weren't designed for Space Marine neurology any more than they had been designed for Primarchs. The surgery had a significant failure rate, with some subjects dying on the operating table when the nails triggered catastrophic neural hemorrhaging. Others survived the procedure but never recovered consciousness, their brains unable to adapt to the nails' interference with basic cognitive function. Those who survived and retained functionality reported immediate and profound changes in their perception and psychology. The constant pain that Angron described became their reality, a baseline discomfort that made rest impossible and inactivity unbearable. Their emotional range narrowed dramatically, with subtle feelings becoming inaccessible while rage remained vivid and overwhelming. The pleasure response from violence was exactly as documented, an intense euphoria that briefly pushed back the pain and created an immediate craving for repetition. Warriors who had been known for their tactical acumen found themselves struggling to maintain focus during planning sessions, their attention constantly drawn toward thoughts of combat. When Angron learned what was happening, his response was characteristically complex. He didn't order the implantations to stop, but neither did he encourage them. He looked at the warriors who had voluntarily subjected themselves to the nails and seemed to see both kinship and contempt. They had chosen this, had walked into damnation with open eyes, while he had never been given that choice. Yet they had done it for him, to better understand and follow him, and that gesture meant something even to his damaged psyche. He began spending more time with the nailed warriors, training with them in the fighting cages, leading them in assaults where their shared neurological condition created a brutal synchronicity. The practice spread through the Legion like a virus. Companies whose commanders had received the nails found their warriors volunteering in increasing numbers. The procedures became more organized as apothecaries refined their techniques and shared information across the fleet. Tech Marines became involved, attempting to improve the implant stability and reduce the failure rate. They experimented with different interface configurations, various materials for the neural filaments, and modified stimulation patterns meant to preserve more cognitive function while maintaining the aggression enhancement. Every modification failed to prevent the fundamental problem. The nails destroyed brain tissue, and no amount of technical refinement could change that basic reality. The Legion's command structure fractured along the lines of nailed and unnailed warriors. Those who had received the implants formed an informal hierarchy based on who had volunteered first, and who had survived the longest with their tactical capabilities relatively intact. They looked at warriors who hadn't taken the nails with a mixture of pity and contempt, seeing them as unwilling to truly commit to their Primarch. The unnailed warriors watched their brother's deterioration with growing alarm, recognizing that the Legion was systematically destroying itself, but unable to stop the process without appearing to reject Angron himself. The tactical consequences manifested rapidly. War Hounds companies with high percentages of nailed warriors showed dramatically reduced flexibility in combat operations. Complex maneuvers that required precise timing and coordination became difficult to execute as individual warriors struggled to maintain focus on anything beyond immediate violence. The Legion's traditional doctrine of controlled shock assault began giving way to simple berserker charges, with nailed warriors throwing themselves at enemy positions without regard for casualties or tactical considerations. In some engagements, this approach proved devastatingly effective. The sheer ferocity of nailed World Eaters could break enemy formations through psychological shock as much as physical damage. In others, it resulted in catastrophic losses when enemies adapted to the predictable assault patterns. The apothecaries documented the progression of neural degradation in nailed warriors with clinical precision. Within months of implantation, subjects showed measurable reduction in prefrontal cortex activity, corresponding to decreased capacity for long-term planning and strategic thinking. Memory formation became impaired, particularly for non-combat experiences. Emotional responses flattened except for anger and the artificial pleasure generated by violence. After a year, many nailed warriors demonstrated difficulty with basic reasoning tasks that would have been trivial before implantation. The rate of deterioration varied by individual, but the trajectory was always downward, always toward a state where nothing remained except the capacity for violence. Some nailed warriors retained more of themselves than others, fighting against the nail's influence through sheer willpower. These individuals became valuable assets, able to lead other nailed warriors with a degree of tactical sophistication while still sharing their neurological condition. They described the experience as living with a constant screaming in their minds, the nails demanding violence every moment while they struggled to maintain enough clarity to function as space marines rather than mindless berserkers. The effort required was immense, and most eventually succumbed to the nails' influence, their personalities eroding until nothing remained but rage and the need to kill. The Legion's librarians, never numerous in the 12th Legion, found their role becoming increasingly difficult. The nails interfered with psychic ability in ways that weren't fully understood, creating neural static that made it harder for librarians to access their powers. Some librarians received the nails anyway, believing that their psychic training would allow them to resist the degradation. They were wrong. The combination of psychic ability and the nails' neural interference created unstable feedback loops that typically resulted in catastrophic psychic phenomena or death. The few librarians who survived implantation lost most of their psychic capability, becoming little different from other nailed warriors, except for occasional uncontrolled bursts of warp energy during combat. Tech Marines approached the nails as an engineering problem, convinced that sufficient technical expertise could overcome the device's limitations. They established workshops dedicated to researching improvements, testing new configurations on servitors, and occasionally on volunteers from the Legion's ranks. The Tech Marines experimented with limiting the nails' suppression of higher brain function, attempting to preserve tactical capability while maintaining aggression enhancement. Every attempt failed because the nails' fundamental design required the destruction of precisely those brain regions responsible for complex thought. The devices couldn't be made safe or stable. They could only be made more or less efficient at their intended purpose of creating controllable killers. The progressive loss of the Legion's tactical flexibility became apparent in campaign after campaign. Opponents who had faced the World Eaters before learned to exploit their predictability. Defensive positions with overlapping fields of fire could devastate nailed warriors who charged directly into kill zones without tactical preparation. Enemies who could absorb the initial assault and counterattack found World Eaters' formations difficult to disengage once committed to close combat, making them vulnerable to encirclement. The Legion's casualty rates climbed steadily as their doctrine simplified into variations on the same basic approach: identify the enemy, charge them, kill everything in reach. Yet the nails also created capabilities that other legions couldn't match. World Eaters' assaults achieved a level of sustained ferocity that was genuinely inhuman, with nailed warriors fighting through injuries that would incapacitate normal space marines. The artificial pleasure response from killing meant that World Eaters actually became more effective as battles progressed and they accumulated kills, rather than experiencing the fatigue and psychological stress that affected other warriors. In extended close-quarters engagements, this gave them an edge that could prove decisive. Enemies who thought they had weathered the initial assault found themselves facing warriors who only grew more dangerous as the fighting continued. The dependence on bloodshed became physiological rather than merely psychological. Nailed warriors who went too long without combat experienced withdrawal symptoms as severe as any narcotic addiction, tremors, hallucinations, violent outbursts directed at anyone nearby. The Legion's fleet had to maintain constant readiness for training exercises that were barely distinguishable from actual combat, with nailed warriors fighting each other in the training cages to stave off the symptoms. Deaths during these exercises became common, accepted as the price of keeping the nailed warriors functional between campaigns. The fighting cages ran with blood at all hours, the sounds of combat echoing through ships that increasingly resembled mobile gladiatorial arenas rather than military vessels. The renaming from War Hounds to World Eaters occurred without ceremony or official proclamation. Angron simply began referring to his legion by the new designation, and the name spread through the ranks like the nails themselves had spread, organically, inevitably, carrying implications that couldn't be ignored. The term World Eaters had originated as an insult from other legions, a sardonic reference to the 12th Legion's increasingly brutal compliance actions, where they seemed intent on killing everything on a planet rather than merely conquering it. Angron adopted the name with deliberate irony, throwing the insult back as a statement of identity. His legion didn't fight for glory or the Emperor's vision of enlightened unity. They fought because the nails demanded it, and if that meant eating worlds, then that was what they would do. The transformation in identity reflected deeper changes in the Legion's character and methodology. The War Hounds had been shock assault specialists who valued controlled aggression and tactical precision. The World Eaters became something else entirely, a force that achieved compliance through systematic extermination of anyone who resisted. The distinction mattered in ways that became apparent during the campaigns that followed Angron's assumption of command. Where the War Hounds had fought to break enemy resistance and force surrender, the World Eaters fought until nothing remained capable of resistance. Prisoners became increasingly rare in World Eaters campaigns, not because of explicit orders, but because nailed warriors simply didn't stop killing until no targets remained. The Genna Scouring demonstrated the World Eaters' new approach to warfare on a scale that shocked even veteran Imperial Army commanders. The Genna system had refused compliance, and its defenders had fortified multiple worlds with extensive defensive networks. The campaign should have been a grinding siege operation, requiring months of careful reduction of enemy strongpoints. Instead, Angron deployed the World Eaters in massive assault waves that hit every fortified position simultaneously. The Legion took horrific casualties in the initial landings, with entire companies cut down by prepared defenses, but the nailed warriors pushed forward regardless. The artificial pleasure response from killing meant that World Eaters who survived the initial assault became progressively more dangerous as they accumulated kills, fighting with escalating fury that overwhelmed defenders who had expected the attackers to break under such losses. The fighting on Genna's primary world lasted 3 weeks, and by the end, the planet's infrastructure had been largely destroyed. World Eaters' assaults didn't distinguish between military and civilian targets once combat began. The nails demanded killing, and any living human satisfied that demand. Cities that might have been preserved for Imperial use were reduced to rubble, as World Eaters fought through every structure hunting for survivors. The planetary government attempted to surrender multiple times, but World Eaters' warriors either didn't receive the communications or ignored them in favor of continued combat. When Imperial army units finally occupied the conquered territories, they found populations that had been reduced by more than 90%, with survivors traumatized by the systematic brutality of the World Eaters' methods. The compliance of Isstvan Prime showcased similar patterns on an even larger scale. The planet's rulers had initially accepted Imperial terms, but then reneged when they calculated that their defensive capabilities could resist Imperial forces. Angron took this betrayal personally, and the World Eater's assault reflected his rage. The Legion made planetfall in force, and Angron led from the front, his presence driving the nailed warriors to even greater extremes of violence. The capital city fell in a single day of continuous fighting, with World Eaters breaching the walls and spreading through the urban terrain like a plague. Angron himself killed the planetary governor in single combat broadcast across the city's communication networks, then continued fighting through the governor's palace until every living thing inside had been slaughtered. The aftermath of Isstvan Prime's compliance created significant tensions with the Imperial army units assigned to garrison the conquered world. The army officers found populations that were either dead or so traumatized that establishing functional governance became nearly impossible. Infrastructure damage was extensive, requiring years of rebuilding rather than the months that would have been necessary with more controlled assault methods. Reports sent back to Terra described the World Eater's actions as excessive and counterproductive to the Great Crusade's goals of bringing human worlds into productive compliance. The Legion's response to these criticisms was characteristically blunt. They had been ordered to bring Isstvan Prime into compliance, and compliance had been achieved. The condition of the planet afterward was not their concern. Relations with other legions deteriorated as word of the World Eater's methods spread through the Crusade fleets. The Ultramarines, whose Primarch Robute Guilliman valued efficiency and minimal collateral damage, found the World Eater's approach fundamentally incompatible with proper military doctrine. Guilliman attempted to discuss the matter with Angron during a joint compliance action in the cleansing of Aragata. The meeting went poorly, with Angron showing no interest in Guilliman's carefully reasoned arguments about sustainable conquest and the importance of preserving conquered populations. Guilliman's emphasis on theoretical principles and long-term planning struck Angron as the kind of thinking that only someone who had never been a slave could indulge in. The nails made extended philosophical discussions physically painful, and Angron ended the meeting by simply walking away while Guilliman was still presenting his points. The word-bearers represented a different kind of friction. Their Primarch Lorgar approached warfare as an extension of faith, seeking to convert populations to imperial truth through a combination of military force and religious fervor. The word-bearers took pride in their ability to bring worlds into compliance while establishing lasting cultural changes that bound conquered populations to the Imperium. They saw the World Eater's methods as wasteful destruction that achieved nothing beyond immediate military objectives. Lorgar himself found Angron's rejection of any higher purpose deeply troubling, viewing it as a form of nihilism that undermined the Great Crusade's spiritual dimensions. The two Primarchs maintained minimal contact, their philosophical differences too fundamental to bridge. The growing tensions came to a head during a joint operation where World Eaters and Ultramarines forces were assigned to bring compliance to a cluster of worlds in the same sector. The Ultramarines approached their assigned targets with characteristic precision, using minimal force to achieve surrender and quickly establishing administrative structures to integrate the worlds into the Imperium. The World Eaters' campaigns in the same sector resulted in massive casualties and infrastructure damage that required extensive Imperial resources to repair. Guilliman filed formal complaints with the War Council, arguing that the World Eater's methods were actively counterproductive and that Angron should be censured for allowing his legion to operate without proper discipline. The complaints reached the Emperor, who summoned Angron to Terra for discussions about the World Eater's conduct. The meeting's details remained private, but Angron returned to his legion unchanged and unrepentant. Whatever the Emperor had said, it had not included orders to modify the World Eater's approach to warfare. Some within the Legion interpreted this as tacit approval, evidence that the Emperor valued results over methodology. Others recognized it as abandonment, the Emperor washing his hands of a son he had failed to save, and a legion he no longer knew how to control. Angron himself never spoke of the meeting, but his contempt for the Imperium seemed to deepen afterward. The Night of the Wolf incident crystallized the fundamental problem that the World Eaters represented for the Imperium's military structure. The exact circumstances remain disputed in imperial records, with some sources placing the confrontation on an unnamed world during a compliance action, while others suggest it occurred in a different context entirely. What is documented is that the Space Wolves, whose Primarch Leman Russ embodied controlled ferocity and the concept of the Emperor's executioner, were tasked with teaching Angron restraint. The Space Wolves prided themselves on their ability to unleash savage violence while maintaining discipline and tactical coherence. They saw the World Eaters as warriors who had lost control, and Russ believed he could demonstrate the difference between a warrior and a berserker. The confrontation began as a planned exercise, but escalated into genuine combat when Angron refused to acknowledge any distinction between the Space Wolves' controlled aggression and the World Eater's nails-driven fury. Russ deployed his forces in a demonstration meant to show how disciplined warriors could defeat numerically superior but less controlled opponents. The Space Wolves executed complex maneuvers, using terrain and coordinated fire to inflict casualties while avoiding direct engagement with the main World Eater's force. The demonstration was proceeding as Russ had planned until Angron, driven by the nails and his rage at being lectured, led a direct assault on Russ's position. What followed was brutal even by Space Marine standards. World Eaters' companies charged through Space Wolves' kill zones, taking massive casualties but maintaining momentum through sheer ferocity. The nailed warriors felt no fear and experienced the pleasure response with each kill, making them immune to the psychological effects that the Space Wolves' tactics relied upon. The Space Wolves found themselves forced into exactly the kind of close-quarters melee that favored the World Eater's strengths. Companies that had maintained cohesion during the initial phases of the engagement were overwhelmed by World Eaters who fought with mechanical efficiency, killing without hesitation or mercy. Angron and Russ met in personal combat, and the fight demonstrated the difference between a Primarch operating at full capacity and one whose mind was being destroyed by the Butcher's nails. Russ was the superior tactician, using the environment and his weapons with practiced skill. Angron was the more savage fighter, his attacks driven by rage and the nails' constant demands for violence. The duel ended inconclusively, with both Primarchs wounded and their respective forces having inflicted significant casualties on each other. Russ had proven that the Space Wolves could match the World Eaters in ferocity while maintaining tactical discipline. Angron had proven that the World Eaters would never stop fighting regardless of casualties or tactical considerations. The aftermath of the Night of the Wolf deepened rather than resolved the issues it had been meant to address. Russ reported to the Emperor that Angron was beyond redemption, that the Butcher's nails had destroyed whatever potential the 12th Primarch might have possessed. The World Eaters who had participated in the engagement wore their wounds as badges of honor, proof that they had faced the Space Wolves and refused to break. Angron's hatred of the Imperium intensified, seeing the incident as yet another example of the Emperor's hypocrisy, sending one son to discipline another through violence, while claiming to represent enlightenment and progress. The World Eaters continued their campaigns throughout the Great Crusade, and their reputation preceded them to every world they approached. Some planets surrendered immediately upon learning that the 12th Legion was en route, preferring Imperial compliance to the alternative of World Eaters' assault. Others chose to fight, either through ignorance of what the World Eaters had become or through determination that death in battle was preferable to submission. The Legion's casualty rates remained high, with nailed warriors dying in numbers that would have been unsustainable for other legions. The World Eaters maintained their strength through constant recruitment and accelerated training programs that prioritized producing combat-ready warriors over the more comprehensive indoctrination other legions employed. The nails continued spreading through the legion's ranks, with new volunteers requesting implantation after every campaign. The failure rate decreased as apothecaries refined their techniques, but the fundamental problems remained unchanged. Every nailed warrior was dying slowly, their brains deteriorating under the nails' influence, their capacity for anything beyond violence eroding with each passing year. The Legion was consuming itself, trading long-term viability for short-term combat effectiveness, and everyone involved understood this reality. The unnailed warriors watched their brother's degradation with growing despair, recognizing that the Legion's path led only to destruction, but unable to alter course without rejecting Angron himself. The War Master's recruitment of Angron to the traitor cause required none of the elaborate persuasion that Horus employed with some of his other brothers. There were no philosophical debates about the Emperor's nature, no carefully constructed arguments about humanity's future, no appeals to ambition or promises of power. Horus understood that Angron needed none of these things because Angron had never truly served the Emperor in the first place. The Primarch of the 12th Legion had been a slave forced into service, compelled to lead a legion he had never wanted in a crusade he despised. The Butcher's nails screamed in his skull every moment, a constant reminder that the Emperor had found him dying with his followers and had chosen to save only him, leaving everyone else to be slaughtered in the mountains of New Syria. When Horus approached Angron aboard the World Eater's flagship Conqueror, he did so with characteristic directness. The War Master had always possessed an ability to understand his brothers, to speak to them in ways that resonated with their individual natures. With Angron, this meant acknowledging the fundamental truth that the 12th Primarch had spent decades refusing to voice in formal settings. The Emperor was a tyrant who had enslaved humanity in the name of unity, who had created the Primarchs as tools rather than sons, who demanded absolute obedience while offering nothing in return but continued service. Horus didn't need to convince Angron that the Emperor deserved to be overthrown. He only needed to offer the opportunity. The conversation took place in one of the Conqueror's training cages, with Angron in the midst of combat practice against a dozen World Eaters simultaneously. The nails made it difficult for him to remain still for extended periods, and Horus had learned that approaching his brother during these sessions meant the discussion would be punctuated by violence. Angron fought with the mechanical efficiency that the nails imposed, killing the sparring partners one by one while Horus spoke. The War Master outlined his plans with the same strategic clarity that had made him the Emperor's chosen commander. The Imperium had become stagnant, the Emperor's vision was flawed, and the Primarchs who had conquered the galaxy deserved to rule it rather than serve as mere administrators of someone else's empire. Angron's response came between kills, his words distorted by the constant interference of the nails, but clear enough in their meaning. He had no interest in ruling anything. The Imperium could burn for all he cared, and if Horus wanted to tear down what the Emperor had built, then Angron and his legion would gladly help reduce it to ashes. The World Eaters didn't fight for political ideals or visions of the future. They fought because the nails demanded it, because violence was the only relief from constant agony, because they were already damned and had nothing left to lose. If that aligned with Horus's rebellion, then so be it. The World Eaters would kill whoever Horus pointed them at, just as they had killed whoever the Emperor had pointed them at. The only difference was that now they would be killing in service to someone who at least had the honesty to admit he was pursuing power rather than pretending to serve some higher purpose. Horus accepted these terms without argument. He had never expected Angron to embrace the rebellion's ideological dimensions or to become a committed advocate for the War Master's vision of a new order. The World Eaters' value lay in their combat effectiveness and their Primarch's complete lack of loyalty to the Emperor. When the time came to strike, Horus could be certain that Angron would not hesitate, would not experience last-minute doubts, would not need to be convinced that patricide was necessary. The 12th Legion had been waiting for permission to turn their weapons on the Imperium since the day Angron had taken command, and now that permission had been granted. The World Eaters' transition from loyal legion to open traitors occurred with minimal internal conflict, because most of the Legion had never been truly loyal to begin with. The nailed warriors who made up the majority of the Legion's strength by this point in the Great Crusade had volunteered for implantation specifically to share their Primarch's suffering, to bridge the gap between themselves and Angron by accepting the same neurological destruction he endured. These warriors followed Angron not out of devotion to the Emperor or the Imperium, but out of a twisted form of kinship forged through shared pain and the artificial pleasure of killing. When Angron declared for Horus, the nailed World Eaters simply continued doing what they had always done, fighting and killing at their Primarch's direction. The unnailed minority within the Legion faced a more complex situation. These warriors had watched their brother's systematic degradation with growing alarm, had seen the Legion transform from the disciplined War Hounds into something barely recognizable as Space Marines. Many had maintained hope that the situation might somehow improve, that the Emperor would intervene, or that Angron might find some way to control the Nail's influence. The War Master's rebellion shattered these illusions. The choice before them was stark: follow their Primarch into open treason against the Emperor they had sworn to serve, or remain loyal to an Imperium that had allowed their Legion to destroy itself without meaningful intervention. Captain Khorne represented the World Eater's character during this period better than perhaps any other individual in the Legion. He had served since the War Hounds era, had fought in some of the Legion's most notable campaigns, and had eventually accepted the Butcher's nails to better understand and lead his nailed brothers. Unlike many who received the implants, Khorne had maintained significant cognitive function despite the nail's degradation effects. He could still plan complex operations, could coordinate with other Legion elements, could function as something more than a simple killer even while the nails screamed for violence. His reputation within the Legion was built on both combat prowess and the respect he commanded from nailed and unnailed warriors alike. When Angron declared for Horus, Khorne's response demonstrated the pragmatic acceptance that characterized the World Eater's approach to the rebellion. He gathered his company's officers and explained the situation with characteristic bluntness. The Emperor had never cared about the 12th Legion beyond their utility as a weapon. He had found their Primarch being destroyed by the nails and had done nothing to save him. He had allowed the Legion to implant the same devices in themselves without intervention or assistance. The Imperium had used the World Eaters as expendable shock troops, accepting their high casualty rates as the price of their effectiveness while offering nothing in return. Now the War Master offered them the opportunity to fight without pretending they served anything beyond their own survival and their Primarch's will. The choice, Khorne concluded, was obvious. Not all World Eaters accepted this reasoning. Scattered throughout the Legion were warriors who had maintained their loyalty to the Emperor despite everything that had happened, who believed that their oaths meant something regardless of how those oaths had been honored by the Imperium. These loyalists represented a minority, perhaps 10 to 15% of the Legion's total strength, but they were concentrated in certain companies and fleet elements. Some were unnailed veterans from the War Hounds era, who had refused implantation and maintained connections to the Legion's original identity. Others were more recent recruits who had been inducted after Angron's discovery, but before the nails had spread through the entire Legion, warriors who still believed in the Great Crusade's stated purpose. The War Master's plan for dealing with loyalist elements within the Traitor Legions was characteristically thorough and ruthless. Horus understood that the rebellion's success required absolute commitment from the legions under his command, that any significant loyalist presence would create vulnerabilities that the Emperor could exploit. The solution was to identify all potentially loyal elements and eliminate them in a single coordinated action that would also serve as the rebellion's opening move. The target was Isstvan III, a world in the Isstvan system that had recently rejected imperial authority and needed to be brought back into compliance. The operation would deploy the World Eaters, Emperor's children, Death Guard, and Sons of Horus, with loyalist elements from all 4 legions making up the primary assault force. The World Eaters' loyalist companies received their deployment orders without any indication that they had been specifically selected for the Isstvan III assault. The operation appeared to be a standard compliance action, though one that would require significant force given the planet's defenses and the reported strength of the rebel forces. The Loyalist World Eaters prepared for combat as they had prepared for countless campaigns before, checking weapons and armor, reviewing tactical data, and conducting the pre-battle rituals that helped focus their minds on the coming violence. Those who had received the nails felt the familiar building pressure that only combat could relieve, while the unnailed warriors mentally prepared for the kind of grinding urban warfare that Isstvan III's cities would require. The initial assault proceeded according to standard World Eaters doctrine. Drop pods and stormbirds delivered the Legion's forces directly into Isstvan III's primary population centers, with companies deploying into the heart of enemy defensive positions. The Loyalist World Eaters fought with their characteristic ferocity, pushing through prepared defenses and engaging the rebel forces in close-quarters combat where the Nailed Warriors' advantages were most pronounced. The fighting was intense from the first moments, with enemy forces that had been expecting Imperial retaliation and had prepared accordingly. The World Eaters advanced through streets that had been fortified into kill zones, taking casualties but maintaining momentum through sheer aggression. Captain Khorne led his company in the assault on one of Isstvan III's main hive cities, his forces breaching the outer defenses and pushing into the urban terrain beyond. Despite having the nails, Khorne maintained enough tactical awareness to recognize when something about the operation felt wrong. The enemy resistance was significant but not overwhelming, suggesting that intelligence estimates of rebel strength had been accurate. Yet the expected support from other Legion elements wasn't materializing as planned. Communications with fleet elements were sporadic, and requests for orbital fire support went unanswered. The World Eaters were advancing, but they were doing so without the coordinated support that major compliance actions typically required. The virus bombing began without warning. War Master Horus had positioned his fleet elements in optimal firing positions above Isstvan III, and at his command, they released their weapons. The Life Eater virus was one of the Imperium's most horrific weapons, a biological agent that consumed all organic matter it contacted with terrifying efficiency. The virus spread through Isstvan III's atmosphere in minutes, an invisible death that killed everything living on the planet's surface. Humans, animals, plants, all organic life died screaming as the virus broke down their cellular structure from the inside. The dying organisms released flammable gases as their bodies decomposed, and when the virus had consumed everything it could reach, the gases ignited in a firestorm that scoured the planet's surface. The World Eaters on the surface had seconds of warning as atmospheric sensors detected the virus deployment. Those in sealed armor had some protection, their suits' environmental systems filtering out the biological agent, but the virus was designed to overwhelm such defenses given time. World Eaters who had been fighting in the open scrambled for sealed structures, fighting their way into buildings and bunkers while the virus cloud descended. The Nailed Warriors experienced the situation through the distorting lens of their implants, the nails interpreting the sudden threat as just another enemy to be fought, demanding violence even as the virus began eating through armor seals and environmental systems. The firestorm that followed the virus's initial kill phase turned Isstvan III's cities into infernos. Temperatures soared to levels that could melt ceramite given sufficient exposure, and the flames consumed everything that had survived the virus itself. World Eaters trapped in the open died as their armor's cooling systems failed, and they were cooked alive inside their own wargear. Those who had reached shelter found themselves besieged by fire that turned buildings into ovens and melted ferrocrete into slag. The Nailed Warriors fought against the flames with the same fury they brought to combat against living enemies, as if sheer aggression could somehow overcome the physics of their situation. Thousands of World Eaters died in the first hours of the virus bombing, killed by the biological agent or the subsequent firestorm. But thousands more survived, their space marine physiology and power armor proving more resilient than Horus had anticipated. The virus couldn't penetrate sealed armor quickly enough to kill before warriors reached shelter, and the firestorm, while devastating, left pockets of survival in the deepest bunkers and most heavily fortified structures. The World Eaters who lived through the initial attack found themselves in a nightmare landscape of ash and fire, their communications disrupted, their fleet support revealed as hostile, and their situation obvious they had been betrayed. The Loyalist World Eaters' response to this betrayal demonstrated the fundamental nature that the Legion had developed under Angron's command. There was no panic, no breakdown in discipline, no desperate attempts to negotiate or understand what had happened. The survivors simply accepted their situation and prepared to make the traitors pay as high a price as possible. The Nailed Warriors felt the familiar pleasure response from the prospect of violence, their implants unable to distinguish between fighting enemies and fighting brothers. The Unnailed Warriors experienced the situation with more emotional complexity, but their response was ultimately the same. They would fight until they were dead, because that was what World Eaters did. The survivors organized themselves around whatever officers had lived through the virus bombing. Company command structures had been shattered, with many captains and senior sergeants dead in the initial attack. The World Eaters who remained formed ad hoc combat groups based on whoever was nearby and still functional, with leadership falling to whoever could maintain enough tactical coherence to coordinate action. These groups began moving through the ruins of Isstvan III's cities, searching for other survivors and securing whatever resources remained intact. The planet's surface was a hellscape of ash and twisted metal, with temperatures still high enough to be dangerous, and the air toxic with the virus's residue and the chemicals released by burning cities. The Traitor Legions deployed ground forces to eliminate the survivors, and the fighting that followed became some of the most brutal of the entire heresy. World Eaters loyalists fought their traitor brothers in the ruins of Isstvan III, and the combat took on a savage character that shocked even veterans of the Great Crusade's worst campaigns. The nailed warriors on both sides experienced the situation through their implants' distorting influence, the pleasure response from killing their own brothers indistinguishable from the response to killing any other enemy. The fighting was close quarters and personal, with World Eaters killing each other in hand-to-hand combat amid the ashes of the world they had been sent to conquer. Captain Khorne survived the initial virus bombing and emerged as one of the Loyalist survivors' key leaders, though his role was complicated by his possession of the nails. He organized World Eaters in his sector of the city into a coherent defensive force, establishing positions in the ruins that could be held against traitor assaults. The nails made extended planning sessions physically painful, but Khorne had learned to function despite the constant interference, breaking complex operations into simple components that could be executed even by heavily nailed warriors. His forces held their positions for weeks, inflicting significant casualties on traitor elements that attempted to dislodge them. The psychological impact of the betrayal affected the Loyalist World Eaters differently than it affected Loyalists from other legions. The Emperor's children Loyalists experienced the betrayal as a violation of their honor and the ideals they had served. The Death Guard Loyalists felt betrayed by a father figure they had trusted. The World Eaters Loyalists had never fully trusted the Imperium to begin with, had never believed in the Great Crusade's stated ideals, had served primarily out of duty rather than conviction. The betrayal confirmed what many had already suspected, that they were expendable tools to be discarded when convenient. This realization didn't break them, because they had never possessed the illusions that breaking would require. The fighting on Isstvan III continued for months as the Loyalist survivors refused to die quickly or quietly. The World Eaters who remained alive fought with the same ferocity they had always brought to combat, and their nailed physiology made them extraordinarily difficult to kill. Warriors who should have succumbed to their wounds kept fighting, driven by the nails' artificial stimulation and the pleasure response from continued violence. The traitor forces found themselves engaged in a grinding war of attrition against enemies who would not retreat, would not surrender, and would not stop fighting until they were physically incapable of continuing. The World Eaters' participation in the Isstvan III atrocity marked the point where the Legion fully committed to the rebellion without any possibility of return. The virus bombing had killed thousands of their brothers, had demonstrated the War Master's willingness to sacrifice anyone who might prove unreliable, and had eliminated the minority of warriors who might have questioned the path Angron had chosen. The World Eaters who remained were those who had followed their Primarch into betrayal willingly, or who had survived the betrayal and now had nothing left but vengeance. The Legion's psychological breaking point had been reached and passed, and what emerged from Isstvan III was a force that had embraced its most violent impulses without any remaining pretense of imperial restraint or purpose beyond killing. The aftermath of Isstvan III left the World Eaters fundamentally changed in ways that went beyond their already considerable brutality. The virus bombing had eliminated the last significant concentration of warriors who might have questioned Angron's path, and the months of fighting against their own brothers had pushed even the most disciplined nailed warriors further toward complete loss of control. The Legion that emerged from the killing fields of Isstvan III was leaner, more savage, and entirely committed to the rebellion not through ideological conviction, but through the simple fact that they had burned every bridge back to the Imperium. The World Eaters had nothing left except their Primarch, their implants, and the endless need for violence that the Butcher's nails demanded. Horus recognized that the World Eaters required careful deployment in the campaigns that followed. The 12th Legion was a weapon that could not be aimed with precision, could not be held in reserve for the right moment, and could not be trusted to operate with the kind of strategic restraint that some campaigns required. What they could do was destroy, completely and without hesitation, anything they were pointed at. The Warmaster's solution was to pair the World Eaters with the Word Bearers for a campaign into Ultramar, the realm of 500 worlds that Roboute Guilliman had spent decades organizing into the Imperium's most efficiently governed region. The pairing was calculated to exploit both Legion's strengths while mitigating their weaknesses. The Word Bearers would provide strategic direction and coordination, while the World Eaters would provide the savage assault capability that could break even the most prepared defenses. Lorgar's motivations for the Shadow Crusade extended beyond simple military objectives. The Word Bearer's Primarch had embraced the powers of the Warp with the fervor of a true believer, and he saw the campaign through Ultramar as an opportunity to demonstrate the superiority of faith over reason. Guilliman represented everything Lorgar despised: cold logic, efficient administration, and the belief that humanity's future could be secured through purely material means. The Shadow Crusade would tear apart Guilliman's perfect realm and prove that all his careful planning meant nothing against the power of genuine conviction, even if that conviction was directed toward gods that the Imperium had spent 2 centuries denying existed. For Angron, the Shadow Crusade offered something simpler and more immediate. Guilliman had lectured him about proper military conduct, had filed complaints about the World Eaters' methods, had embodied the kind of sanctimonious superiority that made the nails scream even louder in Angron's skull. The opportunity to destroy Guilliman's life's work, to reduce the 500 worlds to the same kind of devastation that the World Eaters left everywhere they fought, appealed to Angron's fundamental nature. The fact that this destruction served Horus's strategic objectives was almost incidental. The World Eaters would have gladly torn through Ultramar, even without the rebellion as context, but the heresy gave them permission to indulge their most violent impulses without any pretense of restraint. The Shadow Crusade began with the systematic identification of targets throughout Ultramar's territories. The Word Bearers' intelligence networks had been gathering information about Guilliman's realm for years, mapping supply lines, identifying key production facilities, and cataloging the defensive capabilities of individual worlds. Lorgar's approach to the campaign reflected his legion's methodical nature. Each target was selected for maximum strategic impact, with the goal of crippling Ultramar's ability to support Guilliman's defense of his realm. The Word Bearers would establish the overall campaign strategy, coordinate fleet movements, and handle the complex logistics of operating across hundreds of star systems simultaneously. The World Eaters' role in this arrangement was considerably simpler. They would deploy to worlds that the Word Bearers had identified as targets, make planetfall, and kill everything that resisted until the world's capacity for organized defense had been eliminated. The specifics of how this was accomplished, the casualties taken in the process, and the condition of the worlds afterward were not the World Eaters' concern. Angron made this division of responsibilities clear to his captains during the initial planning sessions. The Word Bearers would tell them where to fight, and the World Eaters would do the fighting. Any attempt by Word Bearers' officers to dictate tactical specifics once combat had begun would be ignored. The first worlds to fall demonstrated the effectiveness of this brutal partnership. The Word Bearers would arrive in system with overwhelming force, their fleet elements establishing orbital superiority while broadcasting demands for surrender. Most worlds refused, trusting in Ultramar's defensive networks and believing that Guilliman would send reinforcements. The Word Bearers would then deploy ground forces to secure key objectives, while the World Eaters made planetfall in the population centers. What followed was systematic destruction that left worlds broken even when they technically remained under Imperial control. The World Eaters didn't distinguish between military and civilian targets once they deployed, the nailed warriors killing anyone they encountered with mechanical efficiency. Armatura represented a significant escalation in the Shadow Crusade's brutality, and the point where tensions between the World Eaters and Word Bearers began affecting operational effectiveness. The world held strategic importance as a major manufacturing center and fleet anchorage, making it a priority target for the campaign. The Word Bearers approached Armatura with their characteristic attention to detail, planning a coordinated assault that would capture key facilities intact while eliminating the garrison forces. The plan required precise timing and coordination between Word Bearers and World Eaters elements, with specific objectives assigned to each legion's forces based on their respective capabilities. The World Eaters deployed to Armatura and immediately ignored the Word Bearers' carefully constructed plan. Angron led the assault personally, his presence driving the Nailed Warriors to even greater extremes of violence. The 12th Legion hit Armatura's primary, Hive City, in a massive wave assault that overwhelmed the defenders through sheer ferocity, but also resulted in catastrophic collateral damage. Facilities that the Word Bearers had intended to capture intact were destroyed in the fighting, with World Eaters' assaults reducing entire industrial complexes to rubble. The civilian population suffered massive casualties as Nailed Warriors fought through residential districts hunting for any remaining resistance. The Word Bearers' forces on Armatura found themselves forced to adapt to the World Eaters' rampage rather than executing their original plan. Word Bearers' officers attempted to coordinate with World Eaters' captains, trying to redirect the 12th Legion's assaults toward militarily significant targets while preserving infrastructure that could be useful to the rebellion. These attempts at coordination failed almost completely because the Nailed World Eaters simply didn't care about strategic objectives beyond their immediate vicinity. A World Eaters company ordered to secure a specific facility would charge toward it, but then get distracted by enemy forces encountered along the way, resulting in extended firefights that had nothing to do with the assigned objective. Lorgar and Angron's relationship deteriorated as the Shadow Crusade progressed, and the pattern established on Armatura repeated across dozens of worlds. The Word Bearers' Primarch valued order and purpose, believing that even destruction should serve larger goals and follow comprehensible patterns. He looked at the World Eaters' methods and saw waste, saw potential that was being squandered through lack of discipline and direction. Lorgar attempted to discuss these concerns with Angron during a meeting aboard the Conqueror, approaching his brother with carefully reasoned arguments about the campaign's objectives and the importance of coordination between their legions. Angron's response demonstrated the fundamental incompatibility between the two Primarchs' worldviews. The Butcher's nails made extended philosophical discussions physically painful, and Lorgar's elaborate explanations about faith and purpose struck Angron as the kind of self-justifying nonsense that people told themselves to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. The World Eaters fought because the nails demanded it, because violence was the only relief from constant agony, because they were weapons that had been pointed at Ultramar and told to destroy. Lorgar's talk about higher purposes and the glory of the gods meant nothing to a Primarch who experienced every moment as torture that only killing could temporarily alleviate. The meeting ended with Angron walking away, while Lorgar was still presenting his arguments, leaving the Word Bearers' Primarch to deal with his frustration at being dismissed. The tensions between the legions manifested in increasingly frequent incidents where World Eaters and Word Bearers' forces came into conflict despite nominally fighting on the same side. World Eaters' companies would advance through objectives that Word Bearers' units were still clearing, resulting in confused firefights where warriors from both legions engaged each other alongside the actual enemy. Word Bearers' officers who attempted to give orders to World Eaters' units found themselves ignored, or, in some cases, threatened with violence by Nailed Warriors who recognized no authority beyond their own chain of command. The campaign's coordination broke down to the point where the Word Bearers simply began planning operations with the assumption that World Eaters' forces would be uncontrollable variables to work around rather than assets to be directed. Despite these coordination problems, the Shadow Crusade achieved its strategic objectives through sheer destructive momentum. World after world fell to the combined assault, with the Word Bearers establishing the operational framework, while the World Eaters provided the brutal shock troops that broke defensive lines. Ultramar's carefully constructed defensive networks proved inadequate against enemies who accepted catastrophic casualties as the price of victory, and who fought with a savagery that overwhelmed defenders psychologically before destroying them physically. The 500 worlds began to fracture as communication lines were cut, supply routes were interdicted, and garrison forces were destroyed faster than Guilliman could redeploy reinforcements. The campaign's progress toward New Syria carried special significance for Angron. The world where he had been enslaved, where he had fought in the arenas, where he had led his doomed rebellion and watched his followers die while the Emperor teleported him to safety, returning to New Syria, represented an opportunity for a kind of closure that the Butcher's nails made difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. Lorgar recognized his brother's obsession with the world and saw in it an opportunity to demonstrate the power that the Chaos Gods could offer. The Word-Bearer's Primarch had been communing with entities in the warp that promised transformation and apotheosis, and he believed that New Syria could serve as the site for Angron's ascension to demonhood. The World Eaters descended on New Syria with Angron at their head, and the assault carried a personal fury that exceeded even the Legion's normal savagery. The Primarch led his warriors directly to the cities where he had been enslaved, fighting through New Syrian military forces with single-minded determination. The High Riders who had once owned him were long dead, their descendants having no connection to the Primarchs, past except through inherited guilt. Angron killed them anyway, along with anyone else who stood between him and the sites of his former captivity. The arenas where he had fought as a gladiator were demolished by World Eaters' assaults, the structures that had held thousands of spectators reduced to rubble by warriors who shared their Primarch's rage at what those places represented. The fighting on New Syria took on a ritualistic quality as Lorgar's plans for Angron's transformation began to manifest. Word-Bearer's sorcerers had been conducting ceremonies throughout the campaign, preparing the way for what they called the Red Angel's ascension. These rituals required massive bloodshed conducted according to specific patterns that would please Khorne, the Chaos God whose domain encompassed violence, rage, and martial prowess. The World Eater's rampage through New Syria provided exactly the kind of offering that such a god would appreciate: senseless slaughter conducted without purpose beyond the act of killing itself. Violence so pure and undirected that it became a form of worship even for warriors who didn't consciously acknowledge any gods. Angron's physical condition had been deteriorating throughout the Shadow Crusade as the Butcher's nails continued their progressive destruction of his brain tissue. The constant warfare had accelerated the damage, with the Primarch spending virtually every waking moment either in combat or in the fighting cages. His ability to communicate had diminished to the point where he rarely spoke in complete sentences, the nails' interference making coherent thought increasingly difficult. His body showed the effects of the neurological damage, with tremors and loss of fine motor control that would have been debilitating in anyone less physiologically robust. The Imperial Medicae staff, who had examined him years earlier, had estimated he might have a century before the nails caused fatal damage. That timeline had proven optimistic. Angron was dying, and everyone who saw him understood that his death was imminent. The Word-Bearer's ritual on New Syria required Angron's death as a necessary component of his transformation. Lorgar had learned from his patrons in the warp that apotheosis to demonhood demanded sacrifice, and what greater sacrifice could there be than a Primarch's life? The ceremony took place in the ruins of the arena where Angron had fought his final battles as a slave, with Word-Bearer's sorcerers establishing the ritual parameters, while World Eater's forces provided security, and more importantly, provided the continuous bloodshed that the ceremony required. The fighting had been ongoing for days, with World Eaters killing New Syrians in numbers that defied comprehension, the streets running with blood that flowed toward the ritual site through channels the Word-Bearers had prepared. Angron stood at the center of the ritual space, while his body finally gave out under the Butcher's nails' accumulated damage. The Primarch's brain could no longer sustain the basic functions necessary for life. The neural tissue, too, degraded to maintain consciousness or autonomic systems. He collapsed, and for a moment it seemed that the Lord of the 12th Legion would simply die as he had lived, in pain, in rage, and without any resolution to the suffering that had defined his existence since the day the High Riders had implanted the nails. The World Eaters who witnessed their Primarch's collapse experienced the moment through their own nails' distorting influence, some feeling rage at being denied their father's leadership, others feeling the artificial pleasure response from the violence surrounding them, and a few feeling something that might have been grief if the nails had left them capable of such emotions. The transformation began as Angron's body died. The warp energies that Lorgar's ritual had summoned poured into the Primarch's corpse, remaking it according to patterns that had nothing to do with the Emperor's original design. Flesh warped and grew, bones lengthened and thickened, skin hardened into something between armor and hide. Wings erupted from Angron's back, leathery and bat-like, capable of bearing his transformed bulk through the air. His skull elongated, and his face twisted into something that barely resembled human features, with horns growing from his temples and his teeth becoming fangs designed for tearing flesh. The butcher's nails, which had been killing him slowly for decades, were subsumed into his new form, becoming part of his demonic nature rather than separate technology. The being that rose from Angron's corpse was a demon Primarch of Khorne, a creature that existed partially in real space and partially in the warp. The transformation had freed him from the nails' constant pain by making that pain part of his fundamental nature, integrated into his existence so completely that it no longer registered as suffering, but simply as the baseline state of being. The new Angron stood 4 meters tall at the shoulder, his body a mass of muscle and brass-colored armor that seemed to be both worn and grown. His face retained enough of its original features to be recognizable, but had been twisted into a permanent expression of rage. The wings allowed him to move with speed that seemed impossible for something his size, and his strength had increased beyond even what a Primarch normally possessed. The World Eaters who witnessed their Primarch's transformation responded with a mixture of awe and recognition. The nailed warriors saw in Demon Angron a reflection of what they themselves were becoming, beings defined entirely by violence, stripped of everything except the capacity and compulsion to kill. The transformation represented both the culmination of everything the Legion had been moving toward since the nails began spreading through their ranks, and a validation of the path they had chosen. If their Primarch could transcend death through the power of the same rage that drove them, then perhaps their own suffering and degradation served some purpose beyond simple destruction. Khorne had been fighting in the streets of New Syria when Angron's transformation occurred, leading his company in assaults that had nothing to do with military objectives and everything to do with the simple need to kill that the nails demanded. The captain had maintained more of his cognitive function than most nailed World Eaters, but the Shadow Crusade's continuous combat had been eroding even his considerable mental resilience. The nails' progressive damage was pushing him toward the same state that most heavily nailed warriors eventually reached, a condition where nothing existed except the immediate moment of violence, where past and future became irrelevant compared to the present opportunity to kill. The incident that would earn Khorne his epithet occurred during the final stages of the New Syrian campaign. His company had been engaged in continuous combat for days, fighting through city districts that had been fortified by desperate defenders who understood that surrender meant death. The nails had been screaming in Khorne's skull without relief, the pleasure response from killing no longer providing adequate relief from the baseline pain. Something in his mind finally broke under the accumulated stress, the last restraints that had allowed him to function as more than a simple killer giving way completely. He turned on the warriors nearest to him, World Eaters from his own company, and began killing them with the same mechanical efficiency he had been using against the New Syrians. The World Eaters who witnessed Khorne's rampage understood immediately what was happening because many had experienced similar episodes themselves. The nails had finally destroyed enough of his brain function that he could no longer distinguish friend from foe, could no longer maintain even the basic recognition of who should and shouldn't be killed. His brothers attempted to restrain him without killing him, recognizing that Khorne represented too valuable an asset to simply execute. The attempt failed because Khorne in his nailed fury was nearly unstoppable, his combat skills undiminished, even as his judgment had been eliminated. He killed more than 40 World Eaters before he finally collapsed from exhaustion, his armor covered in the blood of his own brothers, mixed with enemy blood in patterns that made it impossible to distinguish one from the other. When Khorne recovered consciousness, he found himself restrained aboard the Conqueror, with Angron standing over him in his new demonic form. The demon Primarch looked at the warrior who had just killed dozens of his own brothers and saw not a failure, but a success, someone who had achieved the kind of pure violence that the butcher's nails had always been pushing toward. Khorne had become exactly what the nails were designed to create, a killer who didn't stop killing until physically incapable of continuing, who made no distinction between appropriate and inappropriate targets, who existed only to satisfy the neurological addiction to violence that the implants created. Angron named him Khorne the Betrayer, and the title was both condemnation and recognition. The Shadow Crusade continued after New Syria, but the World Eaters who fought in its later stages were fundamentally different from the Legion that had begun the campaign. Angron's transformation into a demon Primarch had demonstrated that the path they were on led somewhere beyond simple death, that the violence and suffering they endured might result in some form of transcendence, rather than just degradation and extinction. The Nailed Warriors fought with even less restraint than before, actively seeking the kind of complete loss of control that had overtaken Khorne. The Legion's casualty rates increased as warriors threw themselves into combat with no regard for survival, seeking either death or transformation, and finding both outcomes acceptable. Khorne's emergence as Khorne's chosen champion represented the logical endpoint of everything the Butcher's Nails had been doing to the World Eaters since Angron had taken command. The captain had maintained his tactical abilities longer than most, had fought against the Nails' degradation with more success than almost anyone else in the Legion, and had finally succumbed to the same fate that awaited every Nailed Warrior. His killing of his own brothers wasn't seen as a betrayal within the Legion, but as an inevitability, proof that the Nails' ultimate effect was to strip away everything except the capacity for violence. Other World Eaters looked at Khorne and saw their own futures, understood that they were all walking the same path toward the moment when they would no longer be able to distinguish friend from foe, and would simply kill until killed. The World Eaters' approach to the Siege of Terra carried none of the strategic calculation that characterized other Traitor Legions' preparations for the final assault on the Emperor's throne world. Where the Sons of Horus coordinated fleet movements, and the Iron Warriors planned siege operations with mathematical precision, the 12th Legion simply pointed themselves at Terra and began killing everything between their current position and humanity's birth world. The Shadow Crusade had left the World Eaters fundamentally transformed, with Angron's ascension to daemonhood serving as both inspiration and warning for what awaited warriors who had given themselves completely to violence. The Legion that arrived in the Sol system bore little resemblance to the War Hounds who had fought during the Great Crusade's early years, or even to the World Eaters who had deployed to Isstvan III. These were warriors who existed only to kill, whose cognitive functions had degraded to the point where complex thought was nearly impossible, and whose only relief from constant agony came through the act of taking lives. The World Eaters' fleet elements joined the massive Traitor armada that gathered at the system's edge, their vessels bearing the scars of countless campaigns and the modifications that reflected the Legion's descent into Khorne's service. The Conqueror led the World Eaters' contingent, its hull decorated with brass icons and chains from which hung the skulls of enemies killed during the Heresy's campaigns. The ship's interior had been transformed into an extension of the fighting cages, with training areas expanded to occupy spaces that had once served other purposes. The vessel's crew operated in a state of constant alertness because Nailed World Eaters required minimal rest and would sometimes attack crew members when no other outlets for violence presented themselves. The other World Eaters' vessels showed similar modifications, their function reduced to the basic necessities of transportation and fire support, while everything else was stripped away or repurposed to accommodate warriors who could no longer function in traditional ship environments. Angron's presence aboard the Conqueror affected the ship and everyone on it in ways that went beyond simple morale or leadership. As a demon Primarch, he existed partially in the warp, and his nature bled through into real space in a radius around his physical location. World Eaters near their transformed Primarch reported heightened aggression even by their standards, with the nails effects amplified by Angron's demonic aura. The ship's navigators struggled to maintain their duties because the warp currents around the Conqueror had become turbulent and dangerous, twisted by the presence of a being who was simultaneously a Primarch and a demon prince of the Blood God. Crew members who spent too much time in Angron's vicinity sometimes went mad, their minds unable to process the psychic pressure that radiated from something that should not exist in real space. The initial stages of the siege saw the World Eaters deployed in the second wave of assaults, held back from the opening bombardments and the establishment of beachheads on Terra's surface. Horus understood that the 12th Legion could not be used for operations requiring restraint or precision, but their value in breaking prepared defenses through sheer savage momentum remained considerable. The Warmaster's strategy called for the Iron Warriors and Sons of Horus to establish positions on Terra's surface first, creating the framework for sustained siege operations. Once these positions were secure, the World Eaters would be unleashed against specific strongpoints where their particular capabilities could be most effectively employed. The Lion's Gate spaceport represented exactly the kind of target where World Eaters could be deployed without concerns about collateral damage or the need for tactical flexibility. The massive facility served as one of Terra's primary orbital transit points, with defensive capabilities that rivaled many fortress worlds. The spaceport's garrison consisted of Imperial Fists, Mortal Army units, and Titan Legions, all positioned behind fortifications that had been designed to withstand extended siege operations. The structure itself was a marvel of engineering, with walls that could absorb direct hits from battleship-grade weapons and defensive systems that created overlapping fields of fire across every approach vector. Taking the Lion's Gate would require overwhelming force applied without regard for casualties, and the World Eaters specialized in exactly that kind of assault. The World Eaters made planetfall in a massive drop pod and Stormbird assault that deployed thousands of warriors directly into the killing zones surrounding the Lion's Gate. The defenders opened fire immediately, their prepared positions allowing them to engage the World Eaters before the attackers had even fully deployed from their landing craft. Las cannons and heavy bolters cut down World Eaters as they emerged from drop pods, while artillery strikes turned landing zones into craters filled with shattered ceramite and torn flesh. The nailed warriors experienced these casualties through the distorting lens of their implants, the deaths of their brothers registering as background noise, while the nails demanded forward movement toward the enemy positions. Angron led the assault personally, his demonic form making him nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons, and his presence driving nearby World Eaters to even greater extremes of violence. The Demon Primarch moved across the battlefield with speed that seemed impossible for something his size, his wings carrying him over defensive positions while he killed Imperial Fists with his bare hands. Each death fed Angron's demonic nature, strengthening him through the act of taking lives in Khorne's name. The World Eaters followed in their Primarch's wake, charging through fire that should have stopped any assault, taking casualties that would have broken other legions, and maintaining momentum through sheer refusal to acknowledge that they were being destroyed. The Imperial Fists defending the Lion's Gate had prepared for World Eaters' assault tactics, understanding that the 12th Legion would charge directly into defensive positions regardless of casualties. The 7th Legion had established multiple fallback positions, planning to trade space for time while inflicting maximum casualties on the attackers. The strategy worked initially, with World Eaters' companies being channeled into kill zones where concentrated fire could destroy them before they reached the defensive lines. The Imperial Fists fought with the disciplined precision that characterized their legion, every shot placed with careful aim, every position held until the tactical situation demanded withdrawal to the next prepared line. The problem with defending against World Eaters was that they didn't react to casualties the way normal attackers did. Imperial Fist's officers watched through Auspex displays as World Eater's companies took 70, 80, 90% casualties and continued advancing without any loss of momentum. Warriors who should have been dead from their wounds kept fighting, driven by the nail's artificial stimulation and the pleasure response from killing. The carefully prepared fallback positions became death traps when World Eaters who had been assumed dead suddenly rose and attacked from positions that the Imperial Fists had already cleared. The 7th Legion found themselves forced to kill World Eaters multiple times, shooting fallen enemies repeatedly to ensure they wouldn't rise again. The fighting for the Lion's Gate lasted for days, with neither side able to achieve a decisive advantage. The World Eaters pushed forward through casualties that should have been unsustainable, while the Imperial Fists held their positions with the stubborn determination that had made them the Emperor's chosen defenders of the Imperial Palace. The battle became a grinding war of attrition where every meter of ground was contested, where rooms changed hands multiple times as World Eaters' assaults were repulsed and then renewed, where the dead piled up so thickly that they became obstacles that affected tactical movement. Angron rampaged through the spaceport's interior, his demonic form allowing him to tear through bulkheads and structural supports as if they were paper, creating new routes of advance for the World Eaters who followed him. The Imperial Fist's defense finally collapsed when Angron reached one of the spaceport's primary support structures and began tearing it apart with his bare hands. The Demon Primarch's strength was sufficient to damage ferrocrete and plasteel that had been designed to support the weight of orbital craft, and his sustained assault caused a progressive structural failure that threatened to collapse entire sections of the facility. The Imperial Fists recognized that remaining in position would result in their forces being buried under tons of rubble, and they began a fighting withdrawal towards secondary defensive positions. The World Eaters pursued with characteristic savagery, turning the withdrawal into a running battle through corridors choked with debris and the bodies of the fallen. The fall of the Lion's Gate opened a major breach in Terra's defenses and provided the traitor forces with a secure landing zone for reinforcements and supplies. The World Eaters who had survived the assault were immediately redeployed to other sectors where their capabilities could be employed against the next set of defensive positions. There was no rest period, no time for the Legion to recover and regroup after the brutal fighting at the spaceport. The nailed warriors didn't need rest in the traditional sense because the Butcher's nails made inactivity more painful than continued combat. They moved from one battle to the next with mechanical efficiency, their armor still covered in the blood of enemies killed during the previous engagement, their weapons showing the wear of constant use but still functional enough to continue killing. The assault on the Imperial Palace walls represented the World Eaters' participation in the siege's central objective. The palace was humanity's most heavily fortified structure, with walls that stood hundreds of meters high and defensive systems that had been refined over centuries. The Emperor's Praetorian, Rogel Dorn, had spent years preparing the palace's defenses for exactly this kind of assault, creating layers of fortifications that would force attackers to fight for every meter, while being subjected to concentrated fire from positions that had been designed to create perfect killing zones. The World Eaters were assigned to assault sections of the wall where the defenses were strongest, where other legions had already been repulsed, where the only viable tactic was to throw bodies at the defenses until something broke. Khorne the Betrayer led World Eaters' companies in assaults against the Saturnine Wall, a section of the palace's outer defenses that had been identified as a potential breakthrough point. The approach to the wall required crossing open ground that was covered by overlapping fields of fire from defensive positions that could engage targets at ranges where return fire was ineffective. The World Eaters charged across this killing ground in waves, taking catastrophic casualties, but maintaining forward momentum through sheer numbers and the nail's suppression of any survival instinct. Khorne fought at the front of these assaults, his reputation as Khorne's champion making him a figure that other World Eaters followed without question or hesitation. The defenders on the Saturnine Wall included elements from multiple Loyalist legions, Imperial army units, and Custodian Guard, all coordinating their fire to create the most lethal defensive environment possible. They watched the World Eaters come on through fire that should have stopped any assault, watched warriors continue fighting despite wounds that would have killed normal Space Marines, watched as the 12th Legion's assault waves were cut down and replaced by fresh waves that showed no indication they had learned anything from the previous wave's destruction. The psychological impact of facing World Eaters was considerable even for veteran defenders who had fought throughout the heresy. There was something profoundly disturbing about enemies who didn't react to casualties, who seemed to welcome death as much as they welcomed killing, who fought with an intensity that never diminished regardless of how long the battle lasted. Angron's rampage through Terra's defenders became one of the siege's defining horrors. The demon Primarch moved across the battlefield like a natural disaster, his presence warping reality around him as the warp energies that sustained his existence bled through into real space. Loyalist forces that encountered Angron found themselves facing something that conventional weapons could barely harm, that killed with casual ease, and whose mere presence drove nearby World Eaters to even greater extremes of violence. The demon Primarch didn't fight with any particular strategy or tactical awareness, simply moving toward the densest concentrations of enemies and killing until nothing remained in his immediate vicinity before moving on to the next target. The confrontation between Angron and Sanguinius occurred during one of the demon Primarch's rampages through the Imperial Palace's outer districts. The Blood Angels Primarch had been coordinating defensive operations in the sector when reports reached him of a massive demonic entity leading World Eaters' forces in assaults that were breaking through prepared positions. Sanguinius recognized the descriptions as matching his corrupted brother and moved to intercept, understanding that few beings in the Imperium possessed the capability to face a demon Primarch in direct combat. The two Primarchs met in a plaza that had been reduced to rubble by the fighting, with World Eaters and Blood Angels forces engaged in brutal close-quarters combat around them. The duel between Sanguinius and Angron demonstrated the difference between a Primarch operating at full capacity and one who had traded his original nature for demonic power. Sanguinius fought with the skill and precision that had made him one of the Imperium's greatest warriors, his movements calculated to exploit openings while minimizing his own exposure to Angron's attacks. The Angel's weapons were crafted to harm demonic entities, blessed and consecrated in ways that allowed them to damage beings that existed partially in the warp. Angron fought with the savage directness that the Butcher's nails had always imposed, his attacks powerful enough to shatter ceramite, and his demonic resilience allowing him to ignore wounds that would have crippled a normal Primarch. The fight lasted for hours, with neither Primarch able to achieve a decisive advantage. Sanguinius's skill and weapons allowed him to wound Angron repeatedly, but the demon Primarch's nature meant that these wounds healed almost as quickly as they were inflicted, his demonic essence regenerating damage that would have been permanent for a normal being. Angron's attacks forced Sanguinius to fight defensively, unable to press any advantage because a single mistake would result in wounds that even a Primarch's physiology might not survive. The combat destroyed everything in its vicinity, with buildings collapsing under the impact of Primarch-scale weapons and the ground itself cracking from the forces being unleashed. The duel ended not with a clear victor, but with Sanguinius managing to banish Angron's physical form back to the warp. The Angel had been studying demonic entities throughout the siege, learning the techniques that could disrupt their presence in real space. He employed these methods against his brother, speaking words of abjuration that weakened Angron's connection to the material universe, while simultaneously inflicting wounds that would have killed a mortal being dozens of times over. The demon Primarch's form destabilized as the banishment took effect, his physical body dissolving back into the warp energies that had created it. Angron's last moments in real space were spent in rage at being denied his kills, his demonic nature unable to comprehend defeat in any terms except temporary setback. The World Eaters' forces that witnessed their Primarch's banishment experienced the event through the distorting lens of their nails and their devotion to Khorne. They didn't see it as a defeat, but as proof that their Primarch had transcended normal existence, that he could return from death itself because he had become something beyond mortal limitations. The banishment drove the World Eaters to even greater extremes of violence, with warriors throwing themselves at Blood Angels' positions with complete disregard for survival. The fighting in the sector where Angron had been banished continued for days after the duel, with World Eaters refusing to withdraw even after their tactical position had become untenable. The final assault on the Inner Palace represented the siege's climactic phase, with traitor forces pushing toward the Sanctum Imperialis, where the Emperor maintained his command center. The World Eaters participated in these final battles with the same savage directness they had brought to every engagement throughout the siege. They fought through defensive positions that had been prepared by Rogel Dorn himself, through corridors where every corner concealed prepared ambush positions, through rooms where the very architecture had been designed to create perfect killing zones. The World Eaters advanced through all of it, taking casualties that reduced companies to squads and squads to individual warriors, but maintaining forward momentum because the nails demanded it, and because stopping meant experiencing the full agony that only killing could temporarily relieve. Khorne fought through the Inner Palace's defenses alongside the remnants of his company, his armor so covered in blood that its original colors were no longer visible. The betrayer had killed so many enemies during the siege that the exact count had become meaningless, the individual deaths blurring together into a continuous stream of violence that the nails registered only as the pleasure response and the brief relief from pain. He encountered Sigismund, the Emperor's champion and perhaps the Imperium's greatest living swordsman, in one of the palace's inner chambers. The duel that followed demonstrated both warriors' capabilities, with Sigismund's precision and skill matched against Khorne's nailed fury and the favor of Khorne. The fight ended with both warriors wounded, Sigismund forcing Khorne to withdraw while taking injuries that would require extensive healing. The Emperor's confrontation with Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit marked the heresy's turning point, though the World Eaters fighting in the palace's corridors had no immediate knowledge of what was happening in orbit. They continued their assaults against loyalist positions, continued killing with mechanical efficiency, continued following the Nails' demands for violence without any awareness that the rebellion's architect was dying light years above. The news of Horus's death reached the World Eaters gradually, transmitted through fleet communications that many nailed warriors were too focused on immediate combat to process. The information that should have represented a catastrophic strategic setback barely registered for warriors whose cognitive functions had degraded to the point where anything beyond the immediate moment of violence was nearly incomprehensible. The retreat from Terra began in chaos as traitor forces recognized that their cause had failed with Horus's death. The World Eaters withdrew last, not through any planned rearguard action, but simply because they were the slowest to disengage from combat. Nailed warriors continued fighting even as other Traitor Legion elements were pulling back to their ships, unable or unwilling to stop killing, while enemies remained in range. World Eaters' companies had to be physically extracted from combat by their own fleet elements, with Stormbirds deploying to battlefields where the 12th Legion's warriors were still engaged with Loyalist forces despite orders to withdraw. Some World Eaters were left behind entirely, too deep in combat fugue to respond to extraction attempts, continuing to fight until they were killed or until they ran out of enemies in their immediate vicinity. The World Eaters who fled into the Eye of Terror following the Siege of Terra bore little resemblance to the Legion that had begun the heresy, let alone the War Hounds who had served during the Great Crusade's early decades. The retreat was not an organized withdrawal, but a chaotic flight where individual companies and warbands made their own way toward the warp storms that marked the Eye's boundaries. The Legion's command structure, already degraded by the Butcher's Nail's progressive destruction of higher cognitive functions, collapsed entirely during the retreat. Captains who had maintained some degree of tactical coordination during the siege found themselves unable to communicate with other World Eaters' elements, their orders ignored by nailed warriors who recognized no authority beyond the immediate demands for violence that the implants created. The Eye of Terror provided sanctuary for the Traitor Legions, but it was a sanctuary that came with costs that would have been unacceptable to the warriors who had begun the Great Crusade. The region of space where the warp bled through into reality operated according to principles that defied conventional physics and rationality. Time moved inconsistently, with centuries passing in some areas while only moments elapsed in others. The physical laws that governed real space became suggestions rather than rules, with geometry and causality bending in ways that drove unaugmented humans insane. For space marines whose minds had already been damaged by the butcher's nails, the eye's unreality was simultaneously torment and liberation. The constant pain that the nails generated became just another aspect of an environment where suffering was the default state, while the opportunities for violence were endless as warbands fought each other, demons, and the reality-warping inhabitants of demon worlds. The World Eaters scattered throughout the Eye in the years following their arrival, the Legion fragmenting into warbands that ranged in size from a few dozen warriors to several hundred. The fragmentation occurred without any formal dissolution or declaration that the Legion no longer existed as a unified force. World Eaters simply stopped acknowledging any authority beyond their immediate warband leaders, stopped coordinating with other World Eaters elements, stopped thinking in terms of Legion-scale operations. The Butcher's nails made long-term planning and coordination increasingly difficult, and the warbands represented the natural organizational level for warriors whose cognitive functions had degraded to the point where anything more complex than immediate tactical decisions was beyond their capacity. The warbands took names that reflected their nature and the particular obsessions of their leaders. The Bloodied Hands established themselves on a demon world where the ground itself bled, conducting endless training exercises in the form of gladiatorial combat that killed as many warriors as it trained. The Teeth of Khorne became ship-borne raiders who attacked any vessel they encountered regardless of allegiance, their boarding actions leaving nothing alive aboard captured ships. The berserkers of Scalathrax carved out territory in the Eye's outer regions, fighting against other warbands and demon entities with equal enthusiasm. Each warband developed its own identity and traditions, but all shared the fundamental characteristics that the Butcher's nails imposed: an inability to remain inactive for extended periods, a need for constant violence to stave off the nails' withdrawal symptoms, and a progressive degradation of cognitive function that made them increasingly simple killing machines. Khorne the Betrayer emerged as perhaps the most notorious World Eater during the Long War, not through any formal leadership position, but through his reputation as Khorne's favored champion. The Betrayer moved between warbands without permanent allegiance to any, appearing wherever the fighting was most intense and disappearing once the killing was done. His presence was both welcomed and feared by other World Eaters because Khorne's particular curse meant that he would eventually turn on anyone nearby once external enemies were exhausted. Warbands that fought alongside Khorne could expect devastating effectiveness in combat followed by inevitable betrayal when the nails drove him to kill the nearest available targets. The pattern repeated across millennia, with Khorne accumulating a death toll that included thousands of fellow World Eaters alongside the enemies he had been nominally fighting. The relationship between World Eaters, warbands, and Khorne became increasingly explicit as the millennia passed. The Legion had never been particularly religious during the Great Crusade, with Angron's contempt for the imperial truth extending to active hostility toward any talk of gods or higher purposes. The nails had made philosophical considerations painful and irrelevant, reducing existence to the immediate reality of violence and the brief relief it provided. But Khorne's nature aligned so perfectly with what the World Eaters had become that acknowledging the blood god required no particular leap of faith or conversion experience. They killed, and Khorne rewarded killing. They sought battle, and Khorne provided endless opportunities for combat. The relationship was transactional and direct in ways that required no elaborate theology or complex rituals. The World Eaters who survived longest in the Eye were those who embraced this relationship most completely. Warriors who still clung to remnants of their pre-nails identity, who tried to maintain some connection to what they had been before the implants destroyed their higher brain functions, found the long war unbearable. The constant warfare without purpose or end, the progressive degradation of everything that made them more than simple killers, the isolation from any meaningful human connection. These things drove even nailed warriors to despair when they retained enough cognitive function to comprehend their situation. Those who fully accepted their nature as instruments of Khorne's will experience no such conflict. They killed because killing was what they were designed to do, and the fact that this aligned with a chaos god's desires was simply confirmation that they had found their proper place in the universe. The demon worlds that various World Eaters' warbands claimed as bases operated according to the Eye's twisted logic. These planets existed in states of constant flux, their environments shaped by the warp energies that sustained them and the nature of the beings who inhabited them. A World Eater's demon world might feature landscapes composed of skulls and weapons, where the ground was soaked in blood that never dried and the sky rained brass and iron. The inhabitants of such worlds included not just the World Eaters themselves, but also demon entities of Khorne, mortal cultists who worshipped the blood god, and various other beings that had been drawn to or created by the concentration of violence-focused warp energy. These worlds served as staging areas for raids into real space, and as training grounds where World Eaters could satisfy the Nail's demands for violence through constant combat against each other and the demon world's other inhabitants. The Dominion of Fire represented one of the World Eaters' most significant organized campaigns during the Long War's early millennia. The operation began when multiple warbands simultaneously received visions or compulsions, drawing them toward a particular sector of Imperial space. The source of these visions was unclear, possibly Khorne himself, possibly the collective psychic resonance of billions of potential victims, possibly just the Nail's constant demands for violence finding a convenient focus. Regardless of the source, dozens of World Eaters' warbands emerged from the Eye and converged on the target sector with unusual coordination for warriors whose cognitive functions were so degraded. The Dominion of Fire's initial stages demonstrated that World Eaters could still achieve strategic objectives when their fundamental nature aligned with the campaign's requirements. The warbands hit multiple Imperial worlds simultaneously, their attacks coordinated only in the sense that they all occurred in the same general timeframe and targeted the same sector. Each warband fought independently, making planetfall and killing everything they encountered without any attempt to coordinate with other World Eaters' forces. The lack of coordination didn't matter because the sheer number of simultaneous attacks overwhelmed the sector's defensive capabilities. Imperial forces that might have successfully repelled a single warband found themselves facing dozens, with new World Eaters' forces arriving even as they fought to contain existing incursions. The campaign's name came from the World Eaters' methods rather than any official designation. Every world they touched burned, its population slaughtered, and its infrastructure destroyed by warriors who made no distinction between military and civilian targets. The World Eaters didn't conquer in any meaningful sense because they had no interest in holding territory or establishing governance. They simply killed until nothing remained capable of resistance, then moved on to the next world while the previous one burned behind them. The Dominion of Fire lasted for decades, with the World Eaters pushing deeper into Imperial space until Imperial Navy forces and Space Marine reinforcements finally contained the incursion and drove the warbands back toward the Eye. The campaign's aftermath left entire subsectors depopulated and required centuries of Imperial effort to rebuild. The World Eaters who participated gained nothing tangible from their efforts: no territory, no resources, no strategic advantage. What they gained was the only thing they valued: an extended period of continuous violence that satisfied the Nail's demands and earned Khorne's favor. Many of the warriors who fought in the Dominion of Fire died during the campaign, their bodies left on worlds they had helped destroy. The survivors returned to the Eye with their armor covered in the dried blood of thousands of victims, their weapons worn from constant use, and their minds even more degraded by the extended combat than they had been before the campaign began. The pattern established during the Dominion of Fire repeated throughout the Long War on various scales. World Eaters' warbands would emerge from the Eye, attack Imperial or other targets with savage intensity, and then retreat or be destroyed depending on the opposition they encountered. These raids ranged from single warband attacks on isolated Imperial worlds to multi-warband campaigns that threatened entire sectors. The unpredictability of World Eater's raids made them particularly difficult for Imperial forces to counter because there was no strategic logic to analyze or predict. A World Eater's warband might attack a heavily defended Forge world or an undefended agricultural planet with equal enthusiasm, their target selection based on opportunity, and the Nail's demands rather than any calculated assessment of strategic value. The First War for Armageddon demonstrated the threat that a single powerful World Eater's force could pose even in the 41st millennium. Angron had been banished back to the Warp during the Siege of Terra, but demon princes could manifest in real space when conditions permitted and sufficient sacrifices were offered. A massive World Eater's warband led by several champions conducted the rituals necessary to summon their demon Primarch, and Angron materialized on Armageddon at the head of an army of Khornate demons and nailed berserkers. The World Eaters and their demonic allies rampaged across Armageddon's surface, killing millions and threatening to turn the strategically vital Hive world into a demon world that would exist permanently in both real space and the Warp. The Imperium's response to Angron's invasion required the deployment of the Grey Knights, the Chamber Militant of the Ordo Malleus, and the Imperium's specialists in fighting demonic incursions. The Grey Knights engaged Angron and his forces in battles that pushed the Space Marines to their limits, fighting against a demon Primarch whose power had only grown during his millennia in the Warp. The campaign culminated in a battle where the Grey Knight's Supreme Grand Master led his warriors in a ritual combat against Angron, their consecrated weapons and psychic abilities creating the conditions necessary to banish the demon Primarch back to the Warp. The cost was horrific, with the Grey Knights suffering casualties that would take decades to replace and Armageddon's population reduced by billions. The World Eater's warband that had summoned Angron was largely destroyed during the Armageddon campaign, with survivors scattered across the planet's surface and hunted down by Imperial forces over the following years. The Imperium's response to the invasion included not just military action, but also systematic purging of Armageddon's surviving population to eliminate anyone who had witnessed demonic entities or been corrupted by exposure to chaos. The scale of the purge sparked controversy within Imperial command structures, but the Inquisition maintained that such measures were necessary to prevent chaos corruption from spreading. The World Eaters who survived the campaign and escaped Armageddon returned to the Eye with their Primarch banished and their warbands shattered, but the Nails made it impossible for them to process the experience as a defeat. They had fought, they had killed, and that was sufficient. The nature of the Butcher's Nails meant that World Eaters could not maintain the kind of long-term organizational structures that other Chaos Space Marine forces developed during the Long War. The Black Legion built a massive coalition of warbands under Abaddon's leadership. The Word-Bearers maintained their Legion structure and continued pursuing their religious objectives. The Thousand Sons operated according to complex sorceress plans that spanned centuries. The World Eaters simply killed, their warbands fragmenting and reforming in patterns that reflected the Nail's demands rather than any strategic considerations. A warband might grow to several hundred warriors if its leader proved particularly successful at attracting followers, then fragment into dozens of smaller groups when that leader was killed, or when internal violence reduced the warband's numbers below the threshold where coordination was possible. The recruitment of new World Eaters occurred through methods that would have been unrecognizable to the Legion's Great Crusade practices. Warbands raided Imperial worlds not just to kill, but also to capture aspirants who showed the kind of aggression and violence that suggested they would survive the transformation into Chaos Space Marines. These captives were subjected to accelerated implantation processes that had high failure rates, but could produce combat-ready berserkers in a fraction of the time that traditional Space Marine creation required. The Butcher's Nails were implanted as part of this process, with captured tech adepts or dark mechanicum allies performing the surgeries using techniques that had been refined over millennia of creating new nailed warriors. Many aspirants died during implantation, their baseline human neurology unable to adapt to the Nail's interference. those who survived emerged as world eaters who had never known existence without the nails, who had no memories of being anything other than instruments of violence. The relationship between different world eaters' warbands ranged from temporary cooperation to open warfare depending on circumstances and the particular warriors involved. Warbands might fight alongside each other during raids into real space, their combined strength allowing them to tackle targets that would be impossible for individual groups. These alliances lasted only as long as external enemies were available, because the nails made it impossible for heavily nailed warriors to remain inactive once combat ended. Warbands that had fought together against Imperial forces would turn on each other once the immediate threat was eliminated, the nails demanding violence regardless of whether the targets were enemies or allies. This pattern repeated across millennia, with world eaters killing each other in numbers that rivaled their casualties inflicted by Imperial forces. The various Khornate berserker formations that operated throughout the galaxy during the Long War included world eaters' elements, but also warriors from other legions who had embraced Khorne's worship and adopted similar combat doctrines. These formations fought in ways that were nearly indistinguishable from world eaters, charging into close combat with chain axes and bolt pistols, taking casualties without breaking, and continuing to fight until they were dead or victorious. The distinction between actual world eaters and other Khornate berserkers became increasingly meaningless as the millennia passed, because the butcher's nails created a fundamental similarity that transcended legion origins. A warrior with the nails implanted was a world eater in all the ways that mattered, regardless of whether their gene seed came from Angron's line or from another Primarch's legacy. The 13th Black Crusade saw significant world eaters' participation as Abaddon launched his most successful assault on the Imperium since the Horus Heresy. Multiple world eaters' warbands joined the massive coalition of chaos forces that emerged from the Eye, drawn by the promise of unprecedented violence and killing on a scale that even the Nails' demands could appreciate. The world eaters fought throughout the Cadian Gate region, their assaults breaking Imperial defensive lines and creating breaches that other chaos forces exploited. The fall of Cadia and the subsequent creation of the Great Rift provided the world eaters with opportunities for raiding that dwarfed anything available during the previous 10 millennia, with the galaxy split by warp storms that allowed chaos forces to strike deep into Imperial territory. The Indomitus Crusade's attempts to restore Imperial control over territories affected by the Great Rift encountered world eaters' forces on dozens of worlds. The Primaris Space Marines that Roboute Guilliman deployed as reinforcements for the Imperium's battered defenders found themselves facing enemies whose combat doctrine had been refined over 10,000 years of continuous warfare. The World Eaters' lack of tactical sophistication meant that Primaris forces could often outmaneuver and outfight them when coordination and precision mattered. But in close quarters combat, where the World Eaters' advantages were most pronounced, even Primaris Marines struggled against enemies who felt no fear, experienced pleasure from killing, and would fight through wounds that should have been immediately fatal. Khorne's activities during the era of the Great Rift demonstrated that he remained as dangerous in the 41st millennium as he had been during the Heresy. The Betrayer appeared on battlefields across the galaxy, fighting for various chaos forces or simply killing whoever was nearby when the Nails demanded violence. His reputation had grown to legendary status, with both chaos and Imperial forces recognizing him as perhaps the most dangerous individual combatant in the galaxy, below the level of Primarchs and greater demons. Khorne had survived 10,000 years of continuous warfare through a combination of Khorne's favor, his own considerable combat skills, and the Nails' suppression of any survival instinct that might have made him cautious. He killed champions from Loyalist Space Marine chapters, leaders of rival Chaos warbands, Imperial Guard officers, and anyone else who happened to be within reach when combat began. The World Eaters' legacy after 10 millennia of the Long War was written in the billions of deaths they had inflicted and the thousands of worlds they had helped destroy. They had achieved nothing constructive, had built no empire, had created no lasting institutions or achievements that would survive them. What they had done was kill on a scale that satisfied Khorne's endless thirst for blood and skulls, transforming themselves from space marines into living weapons that existed only to take lives. The Butcher's Nails had completed the work they had begun on New Syria, reducing warriors who might have been heroes or leaders into berserkers who could barely remember their own names between episodes of violence. The World Eaters who fought in the 41st millennium were the final evolution of everything the Legion had been becoming since Angron took command, pure instruments of violence, stripped of everything except the capacity and compulsion to kill, serving a god who valued nothing except the act of taking life regardless of whose life was taken or why. Khorne's origins traced back to Terra itself, where he had been recruited into the 12th Legion during its earliest years as the War Hounds. His background matched the typical profile for War Hounds recruits, a hive gang fighter from one of Terra's sprawling undercities who had survived long enough to catch the Legion's attention. The recruiters had watched him fight in the territorial disputes that characterized Underhive life, noting his combination of aggression and tactical awareness. Most gang fighters possessed one or the other, but Khorne demonstrated both, using violence with enough calculation to survive situations that killed less thoughtful warriors. The War Hounds took him, and he proved exceptional even by the standards of a legion that valued close-quarters combat above all else. His rise through the War Hounds' ranks occurred during the Legion's service in the Great Crusade's early decades, before Angron's discovery. Khorne fought in the campaigns that established the 12th Legion's reputation for savage effectiveness, learning the controlled aggression that characterized the War Hounds' approach to warfare. He earned his captaincy through demonstrated capability in battle after battle, his tactical competence matching his combat prowess. When the War Hounds needed warriors who could plan complex operations while still leading from the front in the bloodiest fighting, Khorne represented exactly that combination. His companies achieved objectives with the kind of efficiency that made him valuable to commanders who needed results rather than excuses. The discovery of Angron changed everything for Khorne as it changed everything for the Legion. He was among the War Hounds who first met their Primarch, seeing the giant whose face bore the scars of the Butcher's Nails and whose eyes held constant pain. Khorne recognized immediately that Angron was nothing like what the Legion had expected. Other Primarchs inspired their sons through charisma or tactical brilliance or sheer force of personality. Angron inspired nothing except a kind of horrified, understanding that their gene father was dying and that the Emperor had done nothing to save him. The War Hounds had been weapons without a wielder, and now they had found their Primarch only to discover he was a broken weapon himself. Khorne's appointment as Angron's equerry reflected both his capabilities and the limited options available to a legion whose Primarch showed no interest in traditional command structures. The position of equerry typically involved managing a Primarch's schedule, coordinating between the Primarch and his captains, and handling the administrative details that allowed a legion to function. Khorne performed these duties as well as anyone could given Angron's nature, but the role took on additional dimensions that other equerries never faced. He became a translator of sorts, interpreting Angron's brief and often pained distorted communications for other officers. He managed situations where the Primarch's condition made him dangerous to approach. He organized the fighting cage schedules that gave Angron some relief from the Nails' constant demands. The decision to accept the Butcher's Nails came after years of watching Angron suffer alone. Khorne had seen how the implants isolated their Primarch, creating a barrier between him and his sons that went beyond the normal distance between Primarchs and their legionaries. Angron existed in constant agony that none of them could truly understand, fighting battles where the enemy was inside his own skull, and victory meant only temporary relief before the pain returned. Khorne concluded that the only way to truly serve as Angron's equerry was to share that suffering, to bridge the gap by accepting the same neurological destruction that was killing their Primarch. The logic was straightforward, even if the decision was suicidal. He could not lead warriors who had the Nails if he did not understand what the Nails did to them. The implantation procedure nearly killed him. The apothecaries who performed the surgery had refined their techniques through dozens of previous operations, but the butcher's nails remained fundamentally incompatible with human neurology regardless of how carefully they were installed. Khorne's space marine physiology gave him advantages that baseline humans lacked, but the nails were designed to interface with neural structures in ways that required destroying healthy brain tissue to create the necessary connections. He survived the surgery and the immediate aftermath when many recipients died from neural hemorrhaging or went permanently insane. The recovery period involved learning to function while the nails screamed demands for violence, while every moment of inactivity brought pain that only killing could relieve. What made Khorne exceptional among nailed world eaters was his ability to maintain cognitive function despite the implant's degradation effects. Most warriors who received the nails experienced rapid deterioration of their capacity for complex thought, their minds reduced to the immediate tactical considerations of combat and the constant awareness of the nails' demands. Khorne retained his ability to plan operations that extended beyond single engagements, to coordinate between different World Eaters' elements, to function as something more than a simple killer, even while the nails pushed him toward exactly that reduction. The effort required was immense, a constant battle against the implant's interference that left him exhausted even when his body remained physically capable. Other World Eaters recognized this and followed him not just because of his combat prowess, but because he could still lead them in ways that most nailed warriors could not. His role during the Heresy reflected this unique position. Khorne led World Eaters' forces in assaults throughout the Shadow Crusade and during the Siege of Terra, his companies achieving objectives through a combination of savage violence and the tactical coordination that he somehow maintained despite the nails. He fought alongside Angron during the Primarch's transformation on New Syria, witnessing the apotheosis that turned their gene father into a demon Primarch of Khorne. The transformation affected Khorne deeply because it demonstrated that the path they were on led somewhere beyond simple death, that the violence and suffering they endured might result in some form of transcendence, rather than just degradation and extinction. The incident on Scalathrax that earned Khorne his epithet occurred during the Legion's fragmentation in the years following the Heresy. The World Eaters had retreated into the Eye of Terror as a nominally unified legion, but the Butcher's nails made sustained coordination increasingly impossible. Warbands were forming around individual captains, the Legion's structure dissolving as warriors followed whoever could lead them to the next battle. Khorne commanded significant forces during this period, his reputation and maintained cognitive abilities making him a natural rallying point for World Eaters who wanted leadership that extended beyond simply pointing them at enemies. Scalathrax was an ice world in the Eye's outer regions, valuable for reasons that had more to do with territorial disputes between Chaos forces than any inherent strategic importance. The World Eaters had deployed to the planet to contest control with the Emperor's children, their erstwhile allies from the Heresy, now rivals in the competition for resources and territory within the Eye. The campaign began as a relatively straightforward conflict, with both legions establishing positions and conducting assaults according to their respective doctrines. The World Eaters charged directly at Emperor's children positions, while the Third Legion employed more sophisticated tactics that exploited the World Eaters' predictability. The planet's environment created unique tactical challenges. Scalathrax's surface temperatures dropped to lethal levels during its extended night cycle, cold enough to freeze even Space Marine power armor's joints and kill warriors who remained exposed for too long. Both legions adapted by conducting their operations during the day cycle and retreating to heated shelters when night fell. The pattern created a rhythm to the fighting, with intense combat during daylight hours, followed by enforced ceasefires when survival required both sides to seek shelter from the cold. The arrangement frustrated the World Eaters because the nails made inactivity painful, and the long night cycles meant extended periods where they could not fight. Khorne's breakdown occurred during one of these night cycles. His warband had retreated to their shelters as the temperature dropped, the warriors settling into the kind of restless waiting that nailed World Eaters endured between battles. The nails screamed in Khorne's skull with particular intensity, the enforced inactivity making the pain worse than usual. He had been fighting the implant's influence for longer than most World Eaters survived with the nails, and something in his mind finally gave way under the accumulated stress. The cognitive barriers that had allowed him to maintain discipline and recognize friend from foe collapsed, and suddenly everyone around him was just a potential target for the violence that the nails demanded. Khorne rose from his position and began killing his own warriors. The World Eaters in the shelter initially thought he was responding to some threat they had not perceived, but they quickly realized that their captain was attacking them without provocation or reason. The warriors attempted to restrain him without inflicting lethal damage, recognizing that Khorne represented too valuable an asset to simply kill. The attempt failed because Khorne, in his fully nailed state, was nearly unstoppable, his combat skills undiminished even as his judgment had been eliminated. He killed World Eaters with the same mechanical efficiency he had used against enemies throughout the Heresy, his weapons and armor covered in the blood of warriors who had followed him through dozens of campaigns. The massacre continued as Khorne left the shelter and moved through the World Eaters' positions, killing anyone he encountered regardless of whether they were his own warriors or Emperor's children who had also taken shelter from the cold. The night cycle's extreme temperatures should have killed him as his armor's heating systems failed and the cold penetrated his ceramite plate, but Khorne fought on through conditions that would have incapacitated normal space marines. The nail's artificial stimulation kept him moving, kept him killing, even as his body began suffering from exposure to temperatures that approached absolute zero. He attacked both World Eaters and Emperor's children positions with equal fury, his rampage shattering the informal ceasefire that both sides had maintained during previous night cycles. The survivors from both legions retreated from Scalathrax in chaos, their forces scattered by Khorne's assault and the breakdown in coordination that followed. The World Eaters who escaped the planet did so in small groups. Whatever command structure had existed before Scalathrax now completely dissolved. The incident became the final breaking point for the 12th Legion's unity, with warbands that had maintained some degree of coordination now operating entirely independently. Khorne had demonstrated that even the most disciplined nailed warrior would eventually succumb to the implant's influence completely, that the path every World Eater walked led inevitably to the moment when they could no longer distinguish friend from foe and would simply kill until killed. Angron named him Khorne the Betrayer when they next met, the demon Primarch recognizing in his former equerry the purest expression of what the Butcher's nails created. The title was not condemnation, but acknowledgement, a statement that Khorne had achieved the kind of complete surrender to violence that most World Eaters only approached before death claimed them. Khorne accepted the name because the nails made complex emotional responses to such things impossible, and because on some level he understood that betrayal was simply what World Eaters did. They betrayed the Emperor, they betrayed each other, they betrayed whatever remnants of their former selves still existed beneath the implant's influence. Khorne, the Forsworn, represented a different path to Khornate championship. His origins lay not with the World Eaters, but with another legion entirely, though the specifics of which legion remained unclear in the fragmented records of the Long War. What was documented was that Khorne had embraced Khorne's worship and received the blood god's favor through actions that impressed even by the standards of Khornate champions. He commanded significant forces during the 41st millennium, his warband including both World Eaters and warriors from other legions who had adopted similar combat doctrines. Khorne's approach to warfare combined the savage directness of World Eaters' assaults with a degree of strategic planning that most heavily nailed warriors could not maintain. His campaigns throughout the Imperium Nihilus after the Great Rift's creation demonstrated capabilities that went beyond simple berserker charges. Khorne identified targets with strategic value, coordinated multi-warband assaults that achieved objectives beyond immediate slaughter, and maintained enough discipline among his forces to execute operations that required more than just pointing warriors at enemies. The World Eaters who served under him benefited from leadership that directed their violence toward meaningful targets while still providing the constant combat that the nails demanded. Koselax had not received the Butcher's nails himself, which allowed him to maintain the cognitive function necessary for complex planning, while still earning Khorne's favor through the sheer scale of killing his forces achieved. Invocatus earned his reputation through a different kind of excess. The World Eater's champions specialized in hunting specific targets, tracking down enemy commanders and champions for personal combat rather than simply killing whoever was nearest. This approach required maintaining more cognitive function than most nailed World Eaters possessed, with Invocatus somehow retaining the ability to plan extended hunts while still satisfying the nails' demands for violence. His armor bore the trophies of dozens of kills, with skulls and weapons taken from defeated enemies decorating ceramite that had been painted in patterns that honored Khorne. Invocatus moved between different World Eaters' warbands, offering his services to leaders who needed specific enemies eliminated and accepting payment in the form of information about new targets to hunt. The various warband leaders who commanded World Eaters forces across the galaxy shared certain characteristics regardless of their individual histories. They had survived longer than most nailed warriors through combinations of combat skill, Khorne's favor, and whatever cognitive function they had managed to maintain despite the implant's degradation. They led through demonstrated capability in battle rather than through formal rank or authority, with warriors following them because they provided direction toward the next fight, and because they survived when others died. The turnover among World Eaters' warband leaders was constant, with champions rising and falling based on their ability to continue functioning despite the nails and their capacity to find new enemies to fight. The relationship between World Eaters' champions and Khorne operated on principles that were transactional rather than devotional. The Blood God valued killing above all else, with no concern for the identity of victims or the reasons for their deaths. World Eaters provided exactly what Khorne wanted: constant violence conducted without restraint or purpose beyond the act of killing itself. In return, Khorne granted his favor in forms that ranged from enhanced combat capabilities to outright demonic transformation. Champions who accumulated sufficient kills might find themselves possessed by bloodletters or other Khornate demons, their bodies becoming vessels for entities that existed to kill. Others received blessings that enhanced their strength or resilience, making them even more effective killers and thus more valuable to the Blood God. The process of apotheosis to demonhood remained rare even among Khornate champions because it required not just killing on a massive scale, but killing that impressed a god whose standards for impressive violence were extraordinarily high. Angron's transformation had required the death of an entire world's population conducted according to specific ritual parameters. Other World Eaters who achieved demonhood did so through similarly extreme acts, their ascensions marking them as beings who had transcended the limitations of mortal flesh to become eternal servants of Khorne's will. These demon princes led warbands that included both mortal World Eaters and demonic entities, their nature allowing them to exist partially in the warp while still manifesting in real space to lead assaults. The possession of World Eaters by Khornate demons created warriors who combined space marine combat capabilities with demonic power and the complete absence of any restraint or tactical consideration beyond killing. These possessed champions fought with strength that exceeded even nailed World Eaters, their bodies warped by the demonic entities that inhabited them into forms that barely resembled their original appearance. They led assaults with the kind of unstoppable momentum that broke enemy formations through sheer psychological impact, their presence on the battlefield radiating an aura of violence that affected even disciplined defenders. The possessed champions typically died in battle because their nature made survival impossible. They fought until destroyed, their demonic essence returning to the warp, while their mortal shells were left as corpses on whatever battlefield had finally killed them. Khorne's continued survival through 10,000 years of continuous warfare represented perhaps the most extreme example of Khorne's favor. The betrayer had killed more enemies than most World Eaters' warbands combined, his personal tally including thousands of fellow Chaos Space Marines alongside the Imperial forces and other enemies he had fought. Khorne protected Khorne because he was the perfect instrument of the blood god's will, a warrior who killed without discrimination, who betrayed anyone nearby when external enemies were exhausted, who existed only to take lives regardless of whose lives or why. The pattern of Khorne's activities across the millennia showed no evolution or change because the nails had reduced him to a constant state where nothing existed except the immediate moment of violence and the brief satisfaction it provided before the pain returned and demanded more killing. The World Eaters who operate in the 41st millennium exist as scattered warbands spread across the galaxy, their presence felt wherever the Imperium's defenses show weakness, or where opportunities for large-scale violence present themselves. The legion that once numbered tens of thousands has been reduced to perhaps a few thousand active warriors at any given time, with exact numbers impossible to determine because World Eaters' warbands rarely coordinate or share information. Individual warbands range from a dozen warriors operating from a single corrupted vessel to several hundred, led by particularly successful champions who have managed to attract followers through demonstrated capability in finding and winning battles. These forces move through the galaxy following patterns that appear random to Imperial observers, but actually reflect the simple logic of the butcher's nails. They go wherever fighting is available and stay, until either they are destroyed or the enemies are exhausted. The opening of the Great Rift during the 13th Black Crusade provided World Eaters' warbands with unprecedented opportunities for the kind of sustained violence that their nature demands. Abaddon's assault on the Cadian Gate drew chaos forces from throughout the Eye of Terror, and multiple World Eaters' warbands joined the massive coalition that eventually broke through the Imperium's defenses. The World Eaters who participated in the 13th Black Crusade fought without any particular loyalty to Abaddon or investment in his strategic objectives. They joined because the campaign promised violence on a scale that even the Nails' demands could appreciate, and they fought with the same savage directness they brought to every engagement regardless of the larger context. Their assaults broke Imperial defensive lines through sheer momentum, creating breaches that other Chaos forces exploited, while the World Eaters continued pushing forward until they encountered the next concentration of enemies. The fall of Cadia and the subsequent tearing of reality that created the Great Rift fundamentally altered the strategic situation across the galaxy. The massive warp storm that now bisected Imperial space created regions where the barrier between real space and the warp had become dangerously thin, allowing demon entities to manifest more easily and Chaos forces to strike deep into Imperial territory without the extended warp travel that such operations normally required. For World Eaters' warbands, the Great Rift represented a hunting ground of unprecedented scale. They could emerge from the warp-in systems that had been secure Imperial territory for millennia, conduct their raids, and disappear back into the storm before coordinated Imperial responses could be organized. The Imperium Nihilus, the region of space cut off from the Astronomican's light by the Great Rift, became particularly vulnerable to these raids because Imperial forces in that region lacked the coordination and reinforcement capabilities that Terra's half of the galaxy maintained. Angron's return to real space during the Arcs of Omen campaign demonstrated that demon Primarchs remained capable of manifesting in the material universe when sufficient conditions were met and appropriate rituals conducted. The demon Primarch of the World Eaters had spent most of the 10 millennia since the heresy in the warp, his demonic nature making extended presence in real space difficult to maintain without constant bloodshed to anchor him to material existence. The Arcs of Omen were massive space hulks that Abaddon had corrupted and turned into mobile fortresses capable of traversing the galaxy while carrying entire armies of Chaos forces. Angron manifested aboard one of these vessels, summoned through rituals that had required the sacrifice of thousands of captives and the coordination of multiple World Eaters' warbands, who provided the combat necessary to maintain the Demon Primarch's presence in real space. The Demon Primarch's assault on Imperial worlds in the Imperium Nihilus followed patterns established during the First War for Armageddon, but on a larger scale and with more sustained presence in real space. Angron led combined forces of World Eaters, Khornate demons, and mortal cultists in attacks that devastated entire systems. His presence on battlefields created zones where reality itself became unstable, with the warp bleeding through into normal space and transforming the environment into something that resembled the demon worlds of the Eye of Terror. Imperial defenders who faced Angron found themselves fighting not just against a demon Primarch, but against an entity whose very existence warped the battlefield into terrain that favored Khornate forces. The ground would become slick with blood that appeared from nowhere, the air would fill with the sound of brass horns and screaming, and the barrier between life and death would thin until slain warriors would rise as bloodletters or other demonic entities. The campaign saw Angron assault multiple Imperial worlds in rapid succession, his forces moving through the Imperium Nihilus with the kind of strategic coordination that World Eaters normally lacked. The coordination came not from the World Eaters themselves, but from the overall arcs of Omen campaign structure, with Abaddon's forces providing the logistical framework, while Angron and his followers provided the assault capability. The Demon Primarch's targets included Forge worlds, Hive worlds, and strategic strongpoints that the Imperium needed to maintain control over the Nihilus region. Each assault followed similar patterns. Angron would manifest on the planet's surface, surrounded by World Eaters and demons. His forces would attack the primary population centers with overwhelming violence, and the defenders would be forced to either evacuate or die fighting against enemies who could not be negotiated with or deterred through conventional military means. The Imperium's response to Angron's rampage required deploying its most capable forces, including Space Marine chapters, Grey Knights, and elements of the Adeptus Custodes, who had been operating in the Imperium Nihilus since the Great Rift's creation. The battles against Angron demonstrated the difficulty of combating demon Primarchs in real space. Conventional weapons could wound the demon Primarch, but not permanently harm him because his essence existed in the warp, and his physical form was just a manifestation that could regenerate damage given time. Destroying Angron required either banishing him back to the warp through specific rituals and consecrated weapons, or inflicting sufficient damage that his connection to real space became unstable and his manifestation collapsed. Imperial forces achieved temporary victories by forcing Angron's banishment on several worlds, but the Demon Primarch would return weeks or months later when his followers conducted new summoning rituals and provided fresh sacrifices. The World Eaters' warbands that fought alongside Angron during the Arcs of Omen campaign operated with unusual cohesion, because their Primarch's presence provided direction that their degraded cognitive functions normally made impossible to achieve. Angron did not command his sons in any traditional sense because the Butcher's nails had destroyed his capacity for strategic planning just as thoroughly as they had destroyed that capacity in his warriors. What he provided was a focus for their violence, a target that they could follow toward the next battle. The World Eaters who fought near their Demon Primarch experienced his presence as amplification of everything the nails created. The pain was more intense, the pleasure response from killing was more powerful, and the compulsion toward violence was overwhelming to the point where even basic survival instincts were completely suppressed. These warriors fought with a fury that exceeded their normal savagery, throwing themselves at enemies with complete disregard for tactical considerations or their own survival. The relationship between World Eaters' warbands and other Khornate forces in the 41st millennium operates on principles of temporary convenience rather than lasting alliance. Chaos Space Marines from other legions who worship Khorne fight alongside World Eaters when their objectives align, but these coalitions dissolve as soon as the immediate fighting ends, because nailed warriors cannot remain inactive long enough to maintain any kind of sustained cooperation. The World Eaters provide shock assault capability that other Khornate forces lack, their willingness to take catastrophic casualties making them valuable for breaking prepared defenses. In return, these other forces provide the strategic coordination and logistical support that World Eaters can no longer manage themselves. The arrangement works because both sides gain something from cooperation, but it remains fundamentally unstable because the World Eaters will eventually turn on anyone nearby, when external enemies are exhausted. Mortal cultists who worship Khorne and attach themselves to World Eater's warbands serve multiple purposes despite their obvious inferiority in combat capability compared to Chaos Space Marines. These cultists provide the numerical strength necessary for extended campaigns, occupying territory that World Eaters have cleared and performing the logistical functions that keep warbands supplied and mobile. They also serve as sacrifices when rituals require bloodshed to summon demons or maintain demon primarchs' presence in real space. The cultists understand that following World Eaters means accepting a short and violent existence, but they embrace this fate because Khorne's worship attracts individuals who see death in battle as the highest achievement available to mortals. The World Eaters treat their mortal followers with the same indifference they show toward everything that is not immediate violence, acknowledging their presence only when the cultists prove useful for some specific purpose. Demonic allies from Khorne's legions in the Warp manifest, alongside World Eaters' forces, when conditions permit and appropriate offerings have been made. Bloodletters, the most common Khornate demons, fight with the same single-minded focus on killing that characterizes nailed World Eaters, their demonic nature making them immune to fear or hesitation. Flesh Hounds track enemies across battlefields with supernatural senses, pursuing targets that attempt to escape from World Eaters' assaults. Bloodthirsters, the greater demons of Khorne, appear when massive bloodshed creates the conditions necessary for their manifestation. These towering entities leading combined forces of World Eaters and lesser demons in assaults that break enemy formations through sheer psychological impact. The demons and World Eaters fight well together because both exist primarily to kill, with no complex coordination required beyond pointing them at enemies and letting them attack until nothing remains standing. The ultimate fate of the World Eaters as a legion has already been determined by the choices made millennia ago when the first warriors volunteered for the Butcher's Nails. Every World Eater who receives the implants begins a process of neurological degradation that ends only with death or transformation into something that barely qualifies as sentient. The warriors who survive longest do so by embracing what the nails make them, by accepting that they exist only to kill and that everything else is irrelevant distraction from that purpose. Those who try to maintain their humanity, who struggle against the implant's influence, inevitably fail because the nails are designed to destroy exactly those aspects of consciousness that make such resistance possible. The World Eaters who fight in the 41st millennium are the final products of this process. Beings who have surrendered completely to Khorne's will not through conscious choice, but through the systematic destruction of their capacity to choose anything else. The Legion's future holds nothing except continued violence until the last World Eater dies or ascends to daemonhood. There will be no redemption, no return to sanity, no moment where they recognize what they have become and seek to change course. The Butcher's Nails have destroyed the parts of their minds that would allow such recognition, and Khorne's influence has filled the resulting void with nothing except the imperative to kill. New World Eaters will be created as warbands capture aspirants and subject them to the same transformation that created their predecessors, perpetuating the cycle of violence that has defined the Legion since Angron took command. These new warriors will follow the same path as those who came before: implantation, progressive degradation, death in battle, or transformation into something demonic. The pattern will continue as long as the Butcher's Nails exist, and as long as Khorne values the kind of mindless slaughter that nailed warriors provide. The World Eater's legacy in the 41st millennium is written in the countless billions they have killed across 10,000 years of continuous warfare. They have destroyed worlds, slaughtered populations, and left scars on the Imperium that will never fully heal. They have achieved nothing constructive, built nothing lasting, created nothing of value except corpses. What they have done is demonstrate the ultimate endpoint of the Emperor's Great Crusade's failures: warriors created to be humanity's protectors transformed into its most savage enemies, Primarch's sons reduced to mindless killers, the dream of enlightened unity perverted into an eternity of bloodshed. The World Eaters exist as eternal instruments of Khorne's rage, stripped of everything except the capacity to kill, serving a god who values nothing except the act of taking life. They fight not for conquest or glory or any comprehensible objective, but simply because the butcher's nails demand it, and because they have become incapable of being anything except what the implants made them. Angron's existence as a demon Primarch represents both the culmination of his legion's path and a preview of what awaits other world eaters who accumulate sufficient favor from Khorne. The transformation freed him from the nail's progressive destruction by making that destruction complete, integrating the implant's effects into his fundamental nature so thoroughly that pain and rage became his default state rather than something imposed by malfunctioning technology. The demon Primarch leads his sons not through strategy or inspiration, but through simple presence, his existence providing direction for warriors whose minds can no longer comprehend anything beyond the immediate moment of violence. When Angron manifests in real space, the world eaters follow because he represents what they are all becoming, pure instruments of killing, stripped of everything except the capacity and compulsion to take lives in Khorne's name. The world eaters who fight in the 41st millennium understand, to whatever extent the nails allow them to understand anything, that they are damned. There is no salvation waiting for them, no possibility of redemption or return to what they were before the implants destroyed their minds. They have become exactly what the butcher's nails were designed to create, controllable killers who exist only to satisfy the neurological addiction to violence that the implants generate. The fact that this aligns with Khorne's desires is almost incidental. The world eaters would be killing regardless of whether any gods existed to appreciate their efforts, because the nails leave them no other choice. They are weapons that cannot be sheathed, berserkers who cannot stop fighting, killers who will continue taking lives until they are finally destroyed or transformed into demons that will continue the killing for eternity. This is their fate, their future, and their eternal existence as instruments of the blood god's rage, a cautionary tale written in blood across 10,000 years of humanity's darkest age.